Hello, and welcome to History at Night. I am so glad you are here with me tonight. If this is your first time joining, this is a channel built for quiet hours, for the space between the busyness of the day and the stillness of sleep, a place where we take the great stories of human history and tell them slowly, gently, in enough depth and enough detail to carry you somewhere far away from wherever you are right now. Tonight's story is one I have wanted to tell for a long time. It is one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. The question of how the most sophisticated civilization the Mediterranean had ever seen could simply vanish, seemingly all at once, within the span of a single human lifetime. There is so much to explore together. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Now, let us begin at the end. Not at the very end, not at the moment of fire and ruin and abandonment, but at the end of the beginning, the moment when the world that had been building itself for centuries was at its most fully realized, its most intricate, its most alive, because to truly understand what was lost, we need to feel what it meant for that world to be whole, before we can begin to understand what it meant for it to fall apart. It is the year 1210 BCE. Dawn is breaking over the eastern Mediterranean. The sun comes up over the mountains of Anatolia, over the stone walls of Hattusa, where the Hittite king is already awake and dealing with correspondence that has arrived from the Levantine coast. It comes up over the flat agricultural plains of Mesopotamia, where the irrigation canals are already beginning to glitter and the farmers are already heading out to their fields in the early morning cool. It comes up over the Nile Valley, where the temples of Ramesses the Great still gleam with new paint, and the river is beginning its long cycle of preparation for the flood that will bring life to another year of crops. It comes up over the blue Aegean, where a merchant ship is already moving under a light morning wind, its hold loaded with pottery and bronze, and perhaps a consignment of textiles from one of the palace workshops, making its way between the islands toward the Levantine coast. Everywhere the sun touches this world, people are going about their lives. The palace scribes at Pylos are beginning another day of record keeping, their clay tablets fresh and their styluses ready, another day of tracking the palace economy in the kind of exhaustive detail that the Mycenaean world seems to have required. The bronze smiths at various workshops around the Aegean are beginning another day of production, their furnaces already warm from yesterday, their tools arranged, their work orders clear. The merchants of Ugarit are negotiating in the city's courtyard complexes, debating prices and delivery schedules and the relative creditworthiness of their partners in Cyprus and Egypt and the cities of the Aegean. The farmers in the territories of all these kingdoms are doing what farmers have always done, tending their crops, worrying about the weather, praying for rain. This world, so vivid and so full of life, has been building itself for centuries. The palace complex at Mycenae has been there for 200 years. The Hittite Empire is even older. The Egyptian tradition that undergirds the new kingdom stretches back 2,000 years, and the trade networks that connect all of these places have been developing and thickening and becoming more reliable and more sophisticated for as long as any of these cultures can remember. And none of the people going about their lives on this particular morning, the scribes and the merchants and the bronze smiths and the farmers and the sailors and the priests, none of them know that within 50 years, their world will be gone. Within the lifetime of the children who are being born today, the palaces will be ruins, the writing will be forgotten, the trade will have ceased. The world they are living in, the only world they have ever known, will have become the kind of legend that later peoples will barely be able to believe was real. That is the haunting thing about the Bronze Age collapse. The people who experienced it had no idea it was coming. They had no reason to expect it. The world had been this way for as long as anyone could remember. The palaces had always been there. The trade had always functioned. The system had always delivered what people needed. There had been disruptions before, certainly, wars and famines and earthquakes and plagues, and the system had always recovered. Why would this time be different? It was different. And in the difference lies one of the most sobering lessons that the ancient world has to offer. Let us walk, for a moment, through the physical space of Ugarit, as it was in those final decades before its destruction. Not the ruined site that archaeologists excavated in the 20th century, with its collapsed walls and its scattered tablets and its long silence, but the living city, the city as it was when the merchants were arguing in the courtyard, and the scribes were writing their letters, and the ships were loading and unloading at the harbour. Ugarit sat on a low hill above the coastal plain, a short distance from the sea. Its position was not dramatically defensible, not the kind of rocky hilltop fortress that characterized some ancient cities. It was a commercial city, built where it was because the position served trade, not because it was easy to defend. The harbour, a short distance away at a place the archaeologists call Minet el Beida, was the reason for the city's existence. The city itself was organized in the way of many ancient Near Eastern cities, with a central palace complex at the highest point of the tell, a large building of many rooms surrounding an internal courtyard, which served as the administrative center of the kingdom. The palace at Ugarit was, in the final period of the city's existence, one of the largest and most elaborate in the region. Its rooms included archive rooms, where the clay tablets were kept, rooms for the reception of foreign ambassadors, storage areas for the palace's considerable wealth, and residences for the royal family and the upper officials of the court. Around the palace, the city was divided into residential and commercial districts. Wealthy merchants had large houses with multiple rooms arranged around courtyards, with private chapels and sometimes their own small archive rooms where they kept their business records. The area between the palace and the sea included workshops of various kinds, metalworking and pottery and textile production. Temples to the major gods, including the storm god Baal and the goddess Anat, and others of the Ugaritic pantheon, punctuated the urban landscape. The streets were narrow and irregular, as was typical in ancient cities that had grown organically over centuries rather than being planned from the beginning. They were not paved in the elaborate way that later Roman cities would pave their streets, but they were maintained, the debris of daily life cleared, and the drainage managed. Walking through those streets on a busy morning, you would have heard half a dozen languages. Ugaritic itself, the Semitic language of the city's native population, written in a cuneiform alphabet that the city's scribes had developed. Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy and trade, used for correspondence with Egypt and the Hittites and Babylon. The language or languages of the Cypriot merchants who had a permanent presence in the city, perhaps some form of early Greek from the Mycenaean traders who also maintained connections with Ugarit. Egyptian was probably heard in the streets as well, given the Egyptian diplomatic and commercial presence in the region. The smells of the city would have been as varied as the sounds. The smoke of cooking fires, the salt tang of the sea carried on the morning breeze from the harbour, the smell of the metals being worked in the craft workshops, the distinctive sharp smell of hot copper and tin, the smell of the fish that was probably a major part of the diet of the working population, the richer, more complex smells of the spices and oils and wines that were among the luxury goods circulating through the Ugaritic trade networks. The harbour would have been its own world of sound and smell and activity, ships being loaded and unloaded, the shouted negotiations of merchants trying to get their goods on or off a particular vessel, the creak of rope and timber, the splash of oars, the calling of dock workers and sailors. The harbour at Minet el Beida was not, by the standards of later ancient harbours, an enormous one, but it was busy, regularly busy, with the traffic of the late Bronze Age trade system passing through it. This is the city that was destroyed, suddenly and completely, sometime around 1185 BCE. Not the ruined site that archaeologists found, not the abstraction of a trading node in an economic network, but this living, noisy, smelly, multilingual, commercially active, culturally rich city, full of real people with real names, doing real work, buying and selling and arguing and praying and going home at the end of the day to their families, full of children playing in the narrow streets and old men sitting in doorways and women carrying water from the wells, full of all the ordinary texture of human life. And then, one day, the enemy ships came, and a letter was written and placed in a clay envelope and put in the kiln to dry, ready to be sent, and the fire came before the letter could be dispatched, and the city burned, and no one ever came back to rebuild it. It is worth spending a few minutes on the question of what the final hours of a Bronze Age city might have looked like. We cannot know for certain. The survivors, if there were survivors from the destruction of Ugarit, did not leave us accounts of what happened, but the archaeological evidence, combined with what we know about the character of these cities and the nature of the attacks that destroyed them, allows us to make some careful inferences. The threat had been building for some time. The letters in the palace archive at Ugarit show that the king was aware of dangers approaching from the sea weeks or months before the city was actually attacked. He had sent a contingent of his troops and ships to help another ruler in the region who was under attack. He was exchanging anxious correspondence with the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish and with the king of Alashia. He knew something was coming. What did a city do when it knew something was coming? In an era before city sirens and emergency broadcasts and organized evacuation plans, it did what people in danger have always done. Some people left, taking what they could carry. The wealthy merchants who had connections in other cities, who had partners elsewhere who could receive them, probably had the best chance of getting out in advance. A merchant family with a ship available and business connections in Cyprus or Egypt might have been able to load their most valuable portable goods, their silver and their gold and their most important documents, and sail away before the attack came. Others would have stayed, some because they had no means of leaving, some because they believed the city's defenses would hold, or that the threat had been exaggerated, or simply because they could not bring themselves to abandon the place where they had spent their entire lives, where their ancestors were buried, where their household gods were installed in their shrines. Some because they were too old or too sick or too burdened with young children to travel. The palace administration would have stayed. The king and his court, the officials who ran the government, the scribes who kept the records, these people were bound to the palace in ways that made it very difficult to simply leave. And in any case, someone had to maintain order, had to manage the defense of the city, had to keep the administrative systems functioning for as long as possible. The letters they were writing in the final months suggest people who were frightened, but still working, still trying to do their jobs, still trying to manage the crisis through the normal channels of Bronze Age diplomacy. When the attack finally came, it probably came at night or in the early morning from the sea. The enemy ships, described in the Alashia letter as coming in numbers, would have landed their fighters on the beach below the city. The city's defenses, whatever they were, proved inadequate. The attack was successful. The city was taken. What happened in a city when it was taken by force in the Bronze Age? The evidence from sites where the archaeology is clear suggests systematic looting followed by burning. The looters would have moved through the city quickly, taking the portable wealth, the metals and the textiles and the stored foodstuffs, leaving behind the heavier things, the pottery and the stone furniture and the tablets. Then fire. Some of the fires in the Bronze Age destruction sites were clearly set deliberately as a final act of destruction after the looting was complete. And then the departure. The attackers, whoever they were, moved on. They did not settle in the ruins of Ugarit. They were moving, looking for the next target or the next place to try to settle, part of the larger movement of peoples that was sweeping across the eastern Mediterranean in these years. The ruins of Ugarit were left behind, silent and empty. The looted palace and the scattered tablets and the scorched walls. No one came back to rebuild. The combination of the destruction and the broader disruption of the trade networks that had made Ugarit commercially viable meant that there was no economic basis for reconstruction. The city that existed because trade existed had nowhere to go when trade ceased. It became a tell, a hill of ruined layers, and stayed that way for 3,000 years. Let us trace one more thread before we finally come to rest. The thread of what the Bronze Age collapse means for how we understand the relationship between civilization and resilience. One of the most striking features of the Bronze Age collapse, when you look at it carefully, is the way it affected different places differently. Not everyone collapsed equally. Egypt survived, diminished. The Mesopotamian kingdom survived, diminished. The Phoenician coastal cities of the Levant survived, changed, but continuous. Assyria survived and eventually grew more powerful. Cyprus went through a complex transition but was not depopulated. And conversely, the Mycenaean world collapsed utterly. The Hittite Empire vanished. Ugarit was never rebuilt. The Levantine city-states of the Bronze Age were largely destroyed or permanently transformed. What explains these differences in outcome? Why did some places survive and others not? Part of the answer is geographical. The places that survived best were generally those that had the most direct access to agricultural resources that did not depend on long-distance trade. Egypt's Nile-fed agriculture was more resilient to drought than the rain-fed agriculture of the Aegean or the dry-land farming of much of Anatolia. Mesopotamia's irrigation agriculture was similarly more reliable. The Phoenician cities, perched on a narrow coastal strip with good harbours, could find alternative trade partners when the Bronze Age international system collapsed, and could sustain themselves on the resources of the sea and the hinterland of Lebanon. The Mycenaean palace world, by contrast, had become deeply dependent on long-distance trade for essential commodities, including the tin that it needed to make bronze and the grain imports that fed its population. When that trade system collapsed, the palace economies had nothing to fall back on. The administrative systems that might have organized an effective response to the crisis were themselves dependent on the same palace infrastructure that was failing. Part of the answer is also political and social flexibility. The societies that survived the collapse were, in general, ones that had maintained some degree of decentralization, some capacity for local communities to organize themselves independently of the central state. Egypt's villages had been cultivating their fields and managing their local affairs since time immemorial, and they continued to do so even when the central state was under pressure. The nomadic and semi-nomadic populations of Mesopotamia and the Levantine hinterland were already adapted to a more self-sufficient mode of life and could absorb disruptions that were catastrophic for the more tightly organized palace economies. And part of the answer may simply be luck. The chance arrangement of geography and trade routes and specific historical circumstances that made some places more vulnerable than others to the particular combination of stresses that hit the Bronze Age world around 1200 BCE. This is actually one of the more interesting things about the Bronze Age collapse as a case study in historical catastrophe. It shows that even within a single interconnected system, the impact of a catastrophic disruption can be very uneven, with some parts of the system failing completely, while others survive, and even eventually benefit from the reorganization that the catastrophe forces. The collapse of the Hittite Empire, for example, created opportunities for Assyria to expand into territory that had previously been Hittite. The disruption of the Mycenaean palace economies of the Aegean created conditions in which new, more flexible Greek communities could develop in the absence of the rigid hierarchy of the palace world. This is not to say that catastrophe is good, or that the suffering of the Bronze Age collapse was somehow worthwhile because of what eventually grew from it. The suffering was real and it was vast, but it does suggest that resilience and fragility are distributed unevenly across any complex system, and that the response to catastrophic disruption is always a process of discovering which parts of the system can survive and which cannot, which adaptations are possible and which are not, which seeds are being planted in the ruins, even as the ruins are still smoking. And now, truly, we have come to the end of our long night in the ancient world. We have traced the Bronze Age collapse from its preconditions through its catastrophic center and out the other side into the long aftermath. We have met the people who lived it, and the people who survived it, and the people who, in subsequent centuries, tried to make sense of it. We have asked the difficult questions and received the complicated answers that honest history always gives. What remains, as the night finally deepens toward morning, is simply the experience of having been present with this story, of having let it be real for a while, of having allowed the distance of 3,000 years to become, briefly, a little thinner. The ruins are still there, the tablets are still there, in their museums, still being read. The questions are still there, still being argued by historians and archaeologists and climate scientists and economists, each bringing their own tools to the same mystery. And the sea is still there, the wine-dark sea, the same sea that the Bronze Age merchant ships crossed, and that the sea peoples crossed, and that the Phoenician merchants would later cross, and that the Greek colonists would later cross, and that we still cross today. The human story is long. It is older than writing, older than cities, older than bronze, older than the complex trading systems that the Bronze Age world developed to link its scattered communities into something almost global. And it continues, through catastrophe and dark age and slow recovery and new flowering and new catastrophe, through the rise and fall of civilizations that believed themselves permanent, through the silence of abandoned cities and the patient waiting of ruins for the people who will come to ask their questions. We are those people. We are the ones who came back 3,000 years later to ask the questions, to read the letters that were never sent, to walk through the ruined corridors of the palaces, to hold the clay tablets in our gloved hands and try to read what the scribes wrote in their final days. We are, in some small way, the end of the story that began with the Bronze Age collapse. The world we live in was shaped, however indirectly, by what happened in those 50 years, around 1200 BCE. The alphabet you used to search for this video is descended from the Phoenician script that survived the collapse. The Greek intellectual tradition that runs through the roots of Western civilization began to develop in the Dark Age that followed the collapse. The religious traditions that shaped the world were transformed by the experience of catastrophe and its aftermath. We are the inheritors of the world that the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse built from the ruins of the world they had lost. And tonight, we have spent some time acknowledging that, sitting with it, letting the weight of it settle. The night is ending, dawn will come, and the ruins will still be there in the morning, patient and silent and full of the stories of people who once went about their days in the ordinary, extraordinary human way, who built things and lost them and kept going anyway. Sleep well, you have earned the rest. The story will be here when you wake. History at night. Number. Why did the Bronze Age civilizations all collapse at once? There is something about the night that makes the past feel closer. When the world around you grows quiet and still, when the light is low and the sounds of the day have faded into something distant and soft, the ancient world has a way of pressing in gently. The centuries collapse. The silence between then and now becomes thinner, almost permeable, and if you let yourself drift into it, you can almost hear something on the other side. Tonight, we are going to travel back more than 3,000 years. We are going to visit a world that was, in many ways, more connected, more sophisticated, more alive with commerce and culture and ambition than anything that would exist for centuries after it ended. We are going to walk through the palace corridors of kings who ruled empires stretching from the Aegean to the Euphrates. We are going to stand in the harbours of cities whose merchant ships carried cedar, wood and copper and tin and purple, dye and olive oil and grain across an entire inland sea, binding civilization to civilization in webs of trade, so intricate and so necessary that the removal of any single thread threatened the whole tapestry. And then we are going to watch it all disappear. Not slowly, not over the course of a long and lazy decline that historians can point to and trace with confidence, but suddenly, violently, and almost completely, over the span of perhaps 50 years, a period so brief in the arc of human history that it barely registers as a moment, a world that had taken centuries to build simply ceased to exist. The palaces burned, the writing systems were forgotten, the trade routes went silent, the cities were abandoned. And for reasons that the greatest historians and archaeologists of our time still cannot fully explain, the people who had built one of the most remarkable civilizations the ancient world had ever seen vanished into a darkness that would last for 400 years. This is the story of the Bronze Age collapse. It is one of the great mysteries of human history. And on a night like this, when the world is quiet and you have nowhere to be, there is no better story to tell. So settle in, let the day release its hold on you, and let us go back to a world that was, once, everything. Before we talk about how it ended, we need to understand what was lost. And to understand what was lost, we need to spend some time in the world as it existed before the catastrophe. Not just a glance at it, but a long, slow walk through it, because the tragedy of the Bronze Age collapse is not truly felt until you understand just how extraordinary the civilization it destroyed actually was. The year is approximately 1200 BCE, give or take a few decades on either side. The Mediterranean world is at the height of what scholars would later call the Late Bronze Age. And it is, by almost any measure, a remarkable thing to behold. Picture the eastern Mediterranean as it looked from above, from the perspective of a bird riding the warm air currents above the deep blue water. To the south, along the ribbon of green that follows the Nile through an otherwise unrelenting desert, Egypt stretches enormous and ancient and deeply self-possessed, ruled by the pharaohs of the New Kingdom, still at the height of their power, their temples rising from the floodplain in columns of limestone and sandstone, their scribes recording everything in the dense, intricate script that would eventually be forgotten so completely that it would take 2,000 years and a fortunate accident involving a slab of dark stone inscribed in 3 languages to decode it again. Egypt under Ramesses II, who ruled from 1279 to 1213 BCE, had been the dominant power of the known world for a generation. This was the pharaoh the ancient Greeks would later call Ozymandias, the man who built more temples and raised more monuments and fathered more children than almost any ruler in Egyptian history. His face stared down from colossal statues in a dozen cities. His name was carved into the stone of temples as far south as Nubia and as far north as the Levantine coast. He had fought the Hittites to a bloody standstill at a place called Kadesh in Syria, in one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. And then, rather than continue a war that neither side could decisively win, had done something remarkable. He had negotiated a peace treaty. The world's oldest surviving peace treaty, in fact, a document inscribed in cuneiform on clay tablets and in hieroglyphs on the walls of the temple at Karnak, by which Egypt and the Hittite Empire agreed to respect each other's borders and come to each other's defense in case of attack by a third party. That treaty tells us something important about the world of 1200 BCE. It tells us that diplomacy existed. It tells us that the great powers of the age knew each other well enough to negotiate in formal language, to exchange ambassadors, to send letters back and forth across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. It tells us that the rulers of the late Bronze Age were not isolated chieftains squatting in hilltop fortresses, ignorant of the wider world. They were sophisticated statesmen operating within an international system that had its own rules and its own protocols and its own long history. Let us move our gaze northward now, away from the Nile and into the territory of those Hittites with whom Egypt had made its famous peace. The Hittite Empire in 1200 BCE was centered in Anatolia, in what is now the heart of modern Turkey, with its capital at a city called Hattusa, set in a high, cold valley in the rocky hills south of what would one day become Ankara. Hattusa was a formidable place. Its walls ran for miles across the ridges of the surrounding hills, punctuated by massive stone gates carved with lions and sphinxes and warriors in relief, and through those gates passed the commerce and the correspondence and the political machinations of an empire that stretched from the Aegean coast in the west to the headwaters of the Euphrates in the east. The Hittites were warriors, certainly. Their iron-rimmed chariots had been the deciding factor in 100 battles, but they were also administrators of considerable skill, and their archives, discovered in the early 20th century and containing tens of thousands of clay tablets, reveal a government of surprising sophistication. They kept meticulous records of their treaties and their laws and their religious rituals and their diplomatic correspondence. They traded with everyone. They argued with everyone. They sent their daughters to be married to foreign kings and received foreign princesses in return, the ancient world's version of building alliances through arranged marriages that would later become a European specialty. And to the west of the Hittites, along the deeply indented coastline of the Aegean, and on the islands scattered through that brilliant blue sea, there existed the Mycenaean Greeks. This is not the Greece of Socrates and Plato and the Parthenon. That Greece would come later, after the dark age that followed the collapse we are building toward. The Mycenaean Greeks were a different people, or rather, an earlier version of the same people, living in a different kind of world. They built their palace centers on rocky hilltops, surrounded by massive stone walls made of blocks so enormous that later Greeks, who had forgotten how they were built, would look at them and decide that only giants, which they called the Cyclopes, could have moved such stones. The walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, which survive even today, are made of limestone blocks weighing tons, fitted together without mortar in a technique that requires extraordinary organization and skill, and they have endured for 3,000 years. Inside those walls, the Mycenaean palaces were centers of economic control. The Linear B tablets, the earliest form of written Greek, which were discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of these palaces and finally decoded in the early 1950s by an architect named Michael Ventris, reveal a world of extraordinary bureaucratic complexity. The palace administrators tracked everything: how many bronzesmiths worked in each workshop, how many oxen were available for ploughing in each district, how many women were employed as textile workers, and how much grain they received as payment, how much olive oil was stored in the great pottery jars that lined the palace storerooms. The level of detail is staggering. The Mycenaean world was centered on a handful of these palace cities, each controlling a surrounding territory. Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese, Tiryns nearby, Pylos on the southwestern coast, Thebes and Athens in central Greece, Knossos on the island of Crete, which the Mycenaeans had taken over from the earlier Minoan civilization. These cities were in contact with each other and with the wider Mediterranean world. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Egypt and in the Levant and in Anatolia and in Italy. The palace records at Pylos mention the gathering of rowers, suggesting the outfitting of a fleet. The legends of the Trojan War, which Homer would eventually preserve in his epics, written down centuries later, preserved the memory of a Mycenaean expedition to the coast of Anatolia, a memory so persistent that for a long time people assumed it was pure myth, until a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann, following Homer's descriptions with a literalness that professional archaeologists found embarrassing, actually went to Turkey and dug up a city that bore enough resemblance to the legendary Troy to suggest that something happened there, even if the details are buried beneath layers of later elaboration. And then there were the Canaanites and their most famous descendants, the Phoenicians, the cities of the Levantine coast, places like Ugarit and Byblos and Sidon and Tyre, strung like beads along the narrow coastal plain between the sea and the mountains of Lebanon, were among the most cosmopolitan places in the ancient world. Ugarit, in particular, was a city of extraordinary vitality in the centuries before 1200 BCE. Archaeological excavations there, which began in the late 1920s after a Syrian farmer ploughing his field in the coastal plain near the town of Latakia, accidentally broke into an ancient tomb, have revealed a city that was, in the fullest sense of the word, an international hub. Merchants from Cyprus and Egypt and the Aegean and Mesopotamia had houses there. Multiple languages were spoken in its streets. Its scribes were trained in several different writing systems, so that the palace could correspond with partners in whatever script they preferred. The libraries of Ugarit's palace and temples contained texts in Sumerian, Akkadian, Hurrian, Hittite, Luwian, Ugaritic itself, and even a few fragments of Cypro-Minoan, a script that we still cannot read. The city exported timber from the mountains of Lebanon, which was among the most precious commodities in the ancient world, since Egypt was largely treeless and the Mesopotamian river valleys offered little in the way of large-scale building materials. It exported purple dye, extracted in a smelly and laborious process from a certain species of sea snail called murex, a dye so extraordinarily valuable that it would remain associated with royalty and luxury for 3,000 years. It imported copper from Cyprus, tin from somewhere much farther away, possibly from mines in Afghanistan or Anatolia, grain from Egypt, pottery from the Aegean, silver from Anatolia. It was a city that ran on trade, that existed because trade existed, that would vanish when trade vanished. Somewhere in the eastern part of this picture, in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and the surrounding highlands, were the various successor states to the great Mesopotamian civilizations that had preceded them. Babylon was there, recovering from its sack by the Hittites a few centuries earlier. Assyria was there, in its middle period, strong and aggressive and accumulating power, a preview of the imperial juggernaut it would become in later centuries. The Kassites ruled Babylonia for a remarkably long time, nearly 500 years, providing a period of stability that allowed long-distance trade to flourish. The Mitanni, a kingdom whose ruling class spoke an early form of the language that would eventually become Sanskrit, had been a major power earlier in the century but were in decline by 1200 BCE, squeezed between the Hittites and the Assyrians. And then there was Cyprus, sitting at the center of the eastern Mediterranean, like a comfortable and prosperous middleman, which is exactly what it was. The island was a major producer of copper, so major in fact, that the Latin word for copper, cuprum, is derived from the name of the island, Kypros in Greek, Cyprus in Latin. The island's copper mines had been worked for centuries, and its workshops produced bronze goods that were traded throughout the Mediterranean world. Cypriot pottery is found in archaeological sites from Spain to Syria. The island's cities, places like Enkomi and Kishan and Kalivassos, were wealthy and cosmopolitan, intimately connected to the trade networks that linked the whole eastern Mediterranean into a single economic system. Take all of this together, Egypt and the Hittites, and the Mycenaeans, and the Canaanite cities, and Babylon, and Assyria, and Cyprus, and what you have is something that, if you squint at it from the right angle, looks not entirely unlike the modern global economy. Not in scale, obviously, and not in speed. The fastest communication in this world was a man on horseback, or a ship with a favorable wind, and both were slow by modern standards. But in structure, in the way the different parts depended on each other, in the way the disruption of one part of the system could send ripples through all the others. Copper came from Cyprus, tin came from the Far East or the Far North. You needed both to make bronze, and bronze was the material of everything. Weapons, tools, pots, jewelry, the fittings of ships, the tips of arrows, the blades of swords. Without bronze, the armies could not fight, and the workshops could not function, and the ships could not be built, and the grain could not be harvested. And without the trade that brought copper and tin together from opposite ends of the known world, there was no bronze. Grain came from Egypt and from the Black Sea region. Cities in the Levant and in the Aegean depended on imported grain to feed their populations that had grown too large over the centuries of prosperity to be fed by local agriculture alone. The palace records at Ugarit and at the Mycenaean centers show the management of enormous quantities of imported grain. Without it, people starved. Timber came from Lebanon and from Anatolia. Without timber, there were no ships, and without ships, there was no trade, and without trade, there was no bronze, and without bronze, there was nothing. This was the world of 1200 BCE, intricate, interconnected, prosperous beyond almost anything that had existed before. A world of kings who wrote each other letters and called each other brothers and sent gifts of gold and perfume and textiles, and in some cases their own daughters. A world of merchant ships crossing the open sea with holds full of copper ingots and grain and wine and oil. A world of scribes trained in half a dozen languages, working in palace chanceries that hummed with the business of running an empire. A world of craftsmen producing beautiful things in bronze and ivory and faience and gold and glass. Things so beautiful that when archaeologists found them in the ruins of the palaces, they could hardly believe what they were looking at. And then, within the span of 50 years, it was over. Not gradually, not through a slow decline that left time for adjustment and adaptation. Suddenly, violently, completely, the palaces burned, the records stopped, the trade routes fell silent, the cities were abandoned, and the world that emerged from the ruins was smaller and simpler and darker than anything that had existed for centuries. How? Why? What happened? Those are the questions we are going to spend the rest of this night trying to answer. And I warn you in advance that the answer, to the extent that there is one, is complicated and contested and in some ways deeply unsatisfying, because the truth about the Bronze Age collapse is that we do not fully understand it, even now, after more than a century of archaeological excavation and decades of increasingly sophisticated scientific analysis. We have theories, good theories, well supported by evidence, but we do not have certainty. And in that uncertainty, in that space between what we know and what we can only guess at, there is something that feels very human, the vertiginous sensation of looking at the ruins of a world that was sophisticated and connected and thriving, and realizing that it could simply stop, that everything people had built over centuries could be undone in a generation. That sensation has a name. It is called the Bronze Age collapse, and it is one of the most haunting stories in human history. Let us start with what we actually know. Not theory, not interpretation, but the bare bones of the archaeological and textual record. What does the evidence actually tell us? The first thing it tells us is that the destruction was real and it was widespread. Between approximately 1200 and 1150 BCE, a remarkable number of late Bronze Age sites show evidence of violent destruction and abandonment. Mycenae, the city whose name defines an entire age, shows signs of fire and destruction around 1200 BCE, though it lingered on in diminished form for a few more decades before being finally abandoned. Tiryns was burned. Pylos was burned so thoroughly that the clay tablets in its palace archive, which would otherwise have decayed and been lost, were accidentally baked hard by the conflagration, preserving them for archaeologists 3,000 years later. And among the information preserved on those tablets is what appears to be evidence that the palace administration was aware, in the final days before the destruction, that something threatening was approaching from the sea. Thebes was burned. Orchomenos was destroyed. The Minoan palace at Knossos, which had already been taken over by the Mycenaeans, was destroyed. The list goes on, and it was not just the Greek world. Moving east, the Hittite Empire, which had stood for 4 centuries as one of the great powers of the ancient world, simply collapsed. Hattusa, the imperial capital, with its miles of walls and its massive stone-gated towers, was burned and abandoned around 1180 BCE. The last Hittite king we know of from the records, Suppiluliuma II, appears to have been fighting desperately on multiple fronts in the final years of the empire. But then the records stop. The capital was abandoned, the records stopped being kept, and the Hittite Empire, which had matched Egypt blow for 2 centuries, ceased to exist. The Hittite state did not decline. It did not gradually lose territory and prestige over generations. It vanished. Some smaller Hittite successor states persisted in southern Anatolia for a few more centuries, but the empire itself was simply gone. The Levantine coast was devastated. Ugarit, that cosmopolitan, multilingual, extraordinarily wealthy city at the center of Eastern Mediterranean trade, was destroyed by fire around 1185 BCE and never rebuilt. The ruins of Ugarit contain among the most poignant documents in the entire archaeological record of the ancient world, a series of letters that were found in the palace and in the houses of merchants, letters that were never sent because the city was destroyed before they could be dispatched. They give us a glimpse into the frantic final months of a city that knew it was in danger and was desperately trying to deal with that danger. One letter, from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, which is almost certainly Cyprus, describes ships appearing offshore, enemy ships, and the devastation they are causing along the coast. The tone of the letter is urgent, almost panicked. Another letter, from the Hittite viceroy at a city called Carchemish to the king of Ugarit, tells the Ugaritian king that he should gather his troops and look to his defenses. But the tone is concerned, as though the viceroy himself is not entirely certain of the situation. A third letter, the most haunting of all, is from the king of Alashia to the king of Ugarit, describing how the enemy ships have attacked even Cyprus and burned the cities there. He tells the Ugaritian king that there are 7 ships of the enemy that have committed great destruction. 7 ships. Whatever force destroyed the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, it apparently began with naval attacks. Small at first, 7 ships, and then more. These letters were found in the ruins of Ugarit's palace, still in the clay envelopes in which they had been sealed for delivery. They had been placed in a kiln to dry, to prepare them for sending, and then the city had been destroyed before anyone could take them to their destinations. They sat there in the ruins for 3,200 years, waiting, and when archaeologists finally read them in the 20th century, they found in them a picture of a world frantically trying to understand a threat it had never encountered before, a threat coming from the sea, from people no one seemed to know, in numbers that were overwhelming the defenses of cities that had stood for centuries. South of Ugarit, along the Canaanite coast, City after city shows evidence of violent destruction in the same period. Megiddo, which would give its name to the concept of the apocalyptic final battle. The place we called Armageddon was destroyed. Hazor, one of the largest cities in the Levant, was burned. Lachish was destroyed. The city of Ashkelon on the southern coast of Canaan was burned, and in the ruins of its houses, archaeologists found the skeletons of people who had been killed where they stood. A child's shoe, a cooking pot still on the hearth. In Egypt, the record is different because Egypt survived. But the Egyptian records from this period tell us something about what was happening. Because the pharaohs of the 20th dynasty, the successors of Ramesses II, fought a series of desperate battles against waves of invaders whom they called the Sea Peoples. We will spend more time with the Sea Peoples later, because they are one of the most discussed and most debated elements of the Bronze Age collapse. But for now, let us note that the Egyptian records, particularly the inscriptions on the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu near Luxor, built by Ramesses III in the early 12th century BCE, describe invasions by sea and by land of extraordinary scale and violence, invasions that the pharaoh claimed to have repelled, but that clearly shook Egypt to its foundations. The Medinet Habu inscriptions are remarkable documents. They are accompanied by detailed relief carvings showing the battles between the Egyptians and the Sea Peoples, and in those carvings you can see the faces of the invaders, their distinctive helmets and clothing, their ox carts loaded with women and children and possessions, suggesting that at least some of them were not just raiders but migrants, whole populations on the move. The inscriptions describe them as a coalition of different peoples, with names that scholars have been debating for a century and a half. The Peliset, who may be the Philistines of the Bible, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, who may be related to the Greek Danaoi, one of Homer's names for the Greeks, the Weshesh. Where did they come from? That is one of the questions at the heart of the Bronze Age collapse, and it is a question we will return to. But for now, note this. The Egyptian records describe the Sea Peoples as having already destroyed the Hittites, the Syrians, the Canaanites, the people of Cyprus, before reaching Egypt. They describe the destruction as total, the kind of catastrophe from which no one recovers. And then Ramesses III, having apparently defeated them in a series of battles, settled some of them on the coast of Canaan, where they would become a permanent feature of the landscape. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it emerged from it diminished and changed. The New Kingdom, which had been one of the great empires of the ancient world, never fully recovered. The following centuries saw a slow fragmentation of Egyptian power, the splitting of the country between different rulers, the gradual loss of Egyptian presence in the Levant, the eventual conquest of Egypt by a succession of foreign powers. Egypt did not collapse the way the Hittites collapsed, or the way Ugarit collapsed, but it bent, and it would never again be quite what it had been in the days of Ramesses the Great. So that is the record. That is what we know. In the space of roughly 50 years, the most sophisticated and interconnected civilization the ancient world had yet produced simply fell apart. The palaces burned, the records stopped, the trade ceased, the cities were abandoned. A darkness descended on the Mediterranean world that lasted 4 centuries. And then, slowly, things began again. But they began differently, in different places, with different people and different systems and different ideas. The Greece that emerged from the Dark Age after 800 BCE was not the Mycenaean Greece that had preceded it. It was something new, something that in many ways was simpler and in some ways was more flexible, and that would eventually produce democracy and philosophy and the kind of art and literature that we still read and look at today. But the world that was lost, the world of the Bronze Age palaces, was never rebuilt. What destroyed it? Let us now take a long walk through the theories, because there is no single answer, and the journey through the different explanations tells us as much about human fragility and resilience as the collapse itself does. The first and in some ways simplest explanation is the one that the ancient Egyptians themselves pointed to, the one written large on the walls of the temple at Medinet Habu, the one that appears in the frantic letters from Ugarit and in the Egyptian records from the reigns of Ramesses III and his successors. It is the explanation that dominated scholarly discussion for most of the 20th century: the Sea Peoples. Who were the Sea Peoples? This is a question that has occupied scholars for a very long time, and the answer is still not entirely clear. The term itself is an Egyptological invention, a label applied by modern scholars to the collective groups of raiders and migrants mentioned in Egyptian records from this period. The Egyptians themselves gave them individual names, the Peliset and the Checker and the Shekelesh and the rest, but did not have a single collective term for them. The modern category of Sea Peoples lumps together what may have been quite distinct groups with different origins, different motivations, and different destinations. What we can say with some confidence is that in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BCE, groups of people from somewhere in or around the Aegean world began moving eastward and southward around the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, raiding coastal cities, destroying some, passing through others. Eventually, some settling in the Levant, where the Philistines in particular became established enough to give their name to the entire region, Palestine being derived from Philistia, the land of the Peliset. The Egyptian records, particularly the inscriptions of Ramesses III, describe them in dramatic terms. They speak of a confederation of northerners living in their islands who were disturbed in their isles and who caused a trembling in their lands before they descended in a kind of great wave upon the coastlands. The language is vivid and clearly propagandistic, designed to magnify the threat so as to magnify the glory of the pharaoh who defeated it. But underneath the propaganda, there is a real event being described, and it was clearly serious. The relief carvings at Medinet Habu show the Sea Peoples in extraordinary detail. The Peliset fighters wear distinctive feathered headdresses. The ox carts carrying women and children suggest a population migration rather than just a raiding expedition. The naval battle scenes show Egyptian ships fighting against vessels of a different design in what appears to be the Nile Delta or somewhere along the Egyptian coast. For a long time, the Sea Peoples' explanation for the Bronze Age collapse was basically the entire explanation. Raiders from the north came, destroyed everything, and that was that. End of civilization. Simple and dramatic. But this explanation has a fundamental problem, which is that it explains the destruction without explaining the Sea Peoples themselves. Who were they? Where did they come from? Why were they moving? If they were prosperous inhabitants of the Aegean world, why did they leave? What drove them out of their homes and sent them moving eastward and southward in such force that they brought down one of the great empires of the ancient world? To answer those questions, you need to invoke other causes. And so the Sea Peoples explanation, rather than being an alternative to other theories, becomes one layer of a more complex story that requires climate change and famine and earthquakes and internal social disruption to explain why there were Sea Peoples in the first place. The second major theory, and the one that has gained increasing support in recent decades as new scientific evidence has become available, is climate change. Not the global warming of the modern era, but a significant and sustained drought that appears to have struck the eastern Mediterranean world around 1200 BCE, with enough force to trigger cascading agricultural failures across the entire region. The evidence for this drought has been building slowly over several decades, and it comes from multiple independent sources, which is what makes it compelling. Pollen cores from ancient lakebeds in the Levant and Anatolia and the Aegean show a significant shift in vegetation around 1200 BCE, consistent with a prolonged dry period. Analysis of cave stalactites, which grow in ways that record the amount of rainfall each year with remarkable precision, shows a sharp decrease in precipitation in the region during this period. The isotopic analysis of ancient grain samples from several sites shows patterns consistent with drought conditions. And most dramatic of all, a series of studies published in the early 21st century using increasingly sophisticated paleoclimate reconstructions have placed a major drought event in the eastern Mediterranean, somewhere between 1200 and 1150 BCE, with a degree of confidence that was not possible a generation ago. What would a sustained drought have done to the Bronze Age world? The answer is potentially catastrophic, and for reasons that are directly related to the interconnected nature of that world we spent so much time describing at the beginning of this journey. Consider the grain situation. The palace cities of the Mycenaean world, the Hittite Empire, the Levantine coastal cities, all of them depended on imported grain to feed populations that had grown beyond what local agriculture could sustain. Egypt was the great grain exporter of the ancient world, and the Nile's flood-dependent agriculture made it much more resilient to variations in rainfall than rain-fed agriculture elsewhere. But even Egypt suffered during prolonged dry periods, because reduced rainfall in the Ethiopian highlands reduced the flood that made Egyptian agriculture possible. A drought severe enough to reduce grain production across the region by even 10 or 20% would have created a crisis in systems, with no buffer, no reserve, no alternative supply chain. The palace records at Ugarit include correspondence about grain shortages in the final years before the city's destruction. The Hittite records include letters to the pharaoh begging for emergency grain shipments because the land is dying from hunger. There is a letter from the Hittite king, possibly Hattusili III or one of his successors, that is remarkable in its directness. It tells the pharaoh that the matter of food is a matter of life and death, and asks him to send grain as quickly as possible by ship. No ceremony, no diplomatic niceties beyond the bare minimum, just a desperate request for food. Grain shortages lead to social instability. When people are hungry, they become restless. They cease to support systems that no longer provide for them. They migrate, they raid. They do what they must to survive. In an interconnected system, where the disruption of grain supply in one area cascades immediately into shortages elsewhere, a significant drought could have triggered the kind of systemic failure that left the Bronze Age world unable to cope with the other stresses it was simultaneously facing. And it was facing other stresses simultaneously. That is the key point that the most sophisticated modern analyses of the Bronze Age collapse have come to emphasize. This was not a single cause event. It was what researchers sometimes call a perfect storm, a coincidence of multiple stressors arriving at the same time and in a sequence that amplified each one's impact. The third major theory involves earthquakes, and this one is slightly easier to dismiss as a primary cause, but impossible to dismiss entirely, because earthquakes clearly happened and clearly caused destruction during this period. The Eastern Mediterranean is one of the most seismically active regions in the world. The Anatolian Fault, the same geological structure that produces devastating earthquakes in modern Turkey with tragic regularity, runs through the heart of the region. The area around Greece and the Aegean is similarly prone to seismic activity. In the years around 1200 BCE, geological evidence suggests a significant period of seismic activity that affected multiple sites. Yigael Yadin and other archaeologists who excavated sites in the Levant in the mid-20th century noted that several destruction layers, dating to around 1200 BCE, showed patterns consistent with earthquake damage rather than, or in addition, to fire damage. Walls that had collapsed inward rather than outward, the kind of collapse pattern more consistent with shaking than with siege. Buildings that showed fire, but not the kind of systematic burning that invaders typically produced. The site of Megiddo, which, as we noted earlier, was destroyed during this period, shows evidence that is consistent with earthquake damage. So does Hazor, so do several Mycenaean sites. But earthquakes, even significant earthquakes, do not by themselves explain the abandonment of cities. Just people rebuild after earthquakes. They have done so throughout history. A city destroyed by earthquake might be in ruins for a decade, might suffer economic disruption and population loss, but absent other pressures, the survivors typically stay and rebuild. The Bronze Age sites that were destroyed and abandoned during this period were not rebuilt. That suggests something more than earthquakes at work. What earthquakes could have done, in the context of the other stresses we are discussing, is serve as a trigger, the thing that pushes a system already under strain past the point of recovery. A palace city that is already struggling with drought-reduced grain supplies, already managing the disruption of trade routes, already dealing with social unrest and political instability, is in a very different position when a major earthquake strikes than a city that is prosperous and resilient. The earthquake that would be a manageable crisis in good times becomes an unmanageable catastrophe in bad times. The accumulation of stresses, the interconnected fragility of the system. These themes keep coming back, and they are central to the most persuasive modern understanding of what happened. Let us pause here and breathe for a moment, because we have been covering a lot of ground, and it is worth stepping back to appreciate the human dimension of what we are describing. When we talk about system stresses and cascading failures and climate events and seismic activity, we are using the language of analysis and theory, and that language, useful as it is, can make it easy to forget that every single one of the cities we have mentioned was full of living, breathing, loving, frightened human beings. People who woke up in the morning and worried about their children, and argued with their neighbors, and fell in love, and made dinner, and lay awake at night listening to the sounds of the world outside and wondering what was coming. The woman at Ashkelon, whose skeleton archaeologists found in the ruins of her house, her bronze jewelry still on her wrist, her cooking pot still on the hearth, was not a data point in a climate analysis. She was a person. She had a name that no one now knows. She had a life that is lost except for these few physical traces. She had plans for tomorrow, and tomorrow did not come. The scribe in Ugarit who carefully sealed a letter in its clay envelope and placed it in the kiln to dry, intending to send it to a king in Cyprus to warn him about the approaching danger, had no idea he was creating a document that would survive for 3,200 years, that would be found by people who had machines that flew through the air and instruments that could peer into the composition of ancient clay, and computers that could reconstruct the past with tools he could not have imagined. He just wanted to send a warning. He just wanted to help. He wanted to do his job and go home and perhaps drink a cup of wine and sleep, and then the city burned and none of it happened. We owe it to these people to take their story seriously, to sit with it long enough to let it become real. And one of the ways we can do that is by looking more carefully at what the final days of some of these cities must have looked like, based on what the archaeology tells us. Let us go to Pylos, the palace of Nestor, as it is sometimes called by archaeologists, after the wise old king who appears in Homer's Odyssey as the ruler of Pylos, was a substantial palace centre on the southwest coast of the Greek mainland, overlooking the Bay of Navarino. It had been built and expanded over several generations, and by 1200 BCE it was a functioning administrative centre of the Mycenaean world, with a large central hall, or megaron, whose roof was supported by massive wooden columns, storerooms packed with hundreds of large pottery jars containing olive oil and wine and grain, a workshop district where bronze smiths worked, a bathing room with a built-in tub that is one of the earliest surviving examples of a private bath, and extensive archives of clay tablets recording every detail of the palace's economic activities. And what do those final clay tablets tell us? They tell us that in the months before the palace burned, probably in the year 1180 BCE or thereabouts, the administration was aware of danger. Several tablets record the dispatch of rowers to some coastal position, the gathering of personnel described in a way that suggests military deployment. Others record the allocation of bronze, the one thing that could be used to make more weapons quickly, from temple collections and other stores to bronzesmiths, who were presumably being tasked with making or repairing weapons at an accelerated pace. There is a sense, reading through these tablets, of an administration operating under pressure, trying to respond to a threat that was clearly perceived as serious and probably as imminent, and then the palace burned. The fire was intense enough to bake the clay tablets that were in the archive rooms, preserving them. Intense enough to melt the plaster off the walls and collapse the roof. Intense enough to leave a deep destruction layer that archaeologists could identify immediately when they began excavating in the 20th century. The palace was not just damaged, it was destroyed, thoroughly, and in a way that left nothing standing above the level of the lowest walls. And it was not rebuilt. After the fire, Pylos was abandoned. The people who survived either fled or settled somewhere else, in smaller, simpler communities. The administrative system that had kept track of every jar of olive oil and every set of bronze armor and every rower assigned to every coastal station simply ceased to function. The Linear B script in which those records were kept was forgotten. The knowledge of how to write, which in the palace world of the Mycenaeans was the property of a specialized scribal class, disappeared along with the palaces that employed those scribes. For 400 years, the area of the Pylos Palace was unoccupied. When people eventually returned to the area and built again, they built on a much smaller scale, with different techniques, worshipping different gods, speaking the same basic language, but without the memory of what the palaces had been. Homer, writing or composing in the 8th century BCE, at the end of the Greek Dark Ages, preserved stories about Nestor and Pylos, but those stories were already mythologized, already at several removes from whatever historical reality lay behind them. The Linear B tablets that would have told us what Pylos was actually like in its final days were not discovered until the 20th century, and they were not decoded until the 1950s. The Palace of Pylos is, in miniature, the story of the Bronze Age collapse. A sophisticated, well-organized, complex society, aware of danger, trying to respond to it, failing, burning, and being forgotten for 4 centuries. Now let us spend some more time with the Sea Peoples, because they deserve a longer look, and because the question of who they were and where they came from is both fascinating in itself and directly relevant to the question of what caused the collapse. The standard scholarly consensus for most of the 20th century was that the Sea Peoples were invaders from the Aegean, perhaps Mycenaean Greeks, or people from the islands of the Aegean, who were displaced by the disruptions of the period and began moving eastward in large numbers, raiding and pillaging as they went. This theory had the virtue of geographical plausibility, since the Sea Peoples appear first in records from the western end of the eastern Mediterranean and then progressively further east and south. It also had the virtue of explaining the Egyptian carvings depiction of the Sea Peoples wearing helmets that look similar to those shown in Mycenaean or Aegean art. But there are problems with this theory. The most significant problem is that if the Sea Peoples were Mycenaeans or Aegean islanders, why did they destroy the Mycenaean and Aegean sites? The pattern of destruction in the Greek world and the Aegean does not look like something caused by external invaders coming from outside. It looks like something more complicated, something internal or at least partially internal, perhaps social collapse, perhaps internal conflict, perhaps the kind of breakdown that occurs when a complex administrative system can no longer maintain itself. The destruction at the Mycenaean sites often predates the earliest appearances of the Sea Peoples in Egyptian records. If the Sea Peoples caused the collapse of the Mycenaean world and then moved on to destroy everything else, the timeline does not quite work. A more nuanced view, which has been developed over the past few decades, is that the Sea Peoples were themselves refugees from the general disruption, people who had been displaced from their homes in the Aegean or Anatolia or somewhere in between by the combination of drought and famine and social breakdown and earthquake damage that we have been discussing, and who were now on the move, looking for somewhere else to go. They were not so much the cause of the collapse as one of its symptoms, a human wave set in motion by the same forces that were already destroying the palace civilizations, a wave that then crashed against the surviving cities of the eastern Mediterranean and accelerated the destruction that had already begun. This is a more complex and frankly more tragic version of the story. In this version, the Sea Peoples were not villainous outsiders, bringing destruction to prosperous civilizations. They were people who had already lost their homes, people who were hungry and desperate and traveling with their families in ox carts and their few remaining possessions, trying to find somewhere they could settle and live. They were refugees. The civilizations they struck were simultaneously victims and, in a terrible way, simply the next domino in a sequence that had already been set, falling by the larger forces of climate and disruption. The Egyptian records, read with this perspective, become something different. They describe not a simple invasion, but a collision between a civilization trying to hold on to what it had and a mass of displaced humanity trying to find somewhere to go. Egypt was able to hold. Egypt survived, but the effort cost it greatly, and the world it found itself in afterward was a changed and diminished one. Some of the Sea Peoples, who were settled in Canaan by Ramesses III after his claimed victories, became the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible. The Philistines, in the biblical narrative, are the great enemies of the early Israelites, the people of Goliath, are the Huila, the people whose conflict with the emergent Israelite confederation forms the backdrop for the stories of Samson and Samuel and Saul and David. They were, in the archaeological record, a sophisticated people who brought pottery styles and architectural traditions and certain cultural practices from the Aegean world with them, and who settled the coastal cities of Ashdod and Ashkelon and Ekron and Gath and Gaza, and became a permanent part of the landscape of the ancient Levant. This is one of the strange outcomes of the Bronze Age collapse. Some of the destruction it caused also planted seeds that would grow into new things. The Israelite confederation that would eventually produce the Bible, and through the Bible, both Christianity and Islam, was able to emerge in part because the collapse had removed or weakened the great powers that had previously controlled the Levant. Egypt retreated. The Hittites were gone. The Canaanite city-states were destroyed or weakened. Into the power vacuum that remained, smaller and more flexible political entities were able to grow. The Philistines were one of them. The early Israelites were another. The Phoenicians, the successors of the Canaanite merchants of Ugarit and Byblos, were a third. From the ruins of the Bronze Age world, new things grew that would shape the world for thousands of years. But that is getting ahead of our story. Let us return to the collapse itself and look at some of the other dimensions of it that we have not yet fully explored. One of the dimensions that has received increasing scholarly attention in recent decades is the question of internal social factors. For a long time, the collapse was understood almost entirely in terms of external causes, invaders, climate, earthquakes. But more recent scholarship has pushed back on this and suggested that the palace societies of the Bronze Age were already deeply stressed by internal contradictions before the external shocks arrived. What were these internal contradictions? There were several, and they operated at different levels. The first was the fundamental nature of the palace economy itself. The late Bronze Age palace societies were, in a very real sense, command economies, systems in which the palace controlled the production and distribution of goods with a degree of centralization that left little room for independent economic activity. The Linear B tablets from the Mycenaean palaces show us a system in which everything was tracked and managed from the center, in which craftsmen were palace employees who received their materials and their food rations from the palace and produced goods that went back to the palace, in which farmers in the surrounding territory paid their taxes in agricultural products that were stored in the palace and redistributed according to the palace's needs. This kind of centralized command economy is efficient in good times. It allows the concentration of resources for large projects, for the maintenance of armies and navies, for the construction of the kinds of massive public buildings that characterize these societies. But it is brittle. It depends on the continuous functioning of the administrative apparatus at its center. If the center fails, if the palace is burned, or the administration collapses, or the records are lost, the whole system falls apart because there is no secondary, decentralized system to take up the slack. Compare this to the society that emerged in Greece after the Dark Ages, the polis system of independent city-states with their market economies and their citizen farmers and their relatively decentralized economic organization. That system was much more resilient, much better able to absorb shocks, much more flexible in the face of disruption. It was also, in some ways, less capable of the grand achievements of the palace era. You do not build things like the Lion Gate at Mycenae or the Great Palace at Hattusa in a decentralized market economy, but you can survive a crisis that would destroy a palace economy because the destruction of any single center does not bring down the whole. The second internal contradiction was social. The palace societies were, by any measure, deeply hierarchical. At the top were the kings and their immediate families and their high officials. Below them were the various grades of professional specialists, the scribes and the craftsmen and the military officers and the priests. Below them were the free farmers and herders who paid taxes to the palace, and at the bottom were the unfree, the slaves and the dependent laborers who did the hardest and most unpleasant work. This hierarchy had been sustained for centuries, and for centuries it had worked, because the palace system delivered real benefits to people at various levels of it. The The craftsmen got their materials and their rations. The farmers got security and, in theory, access to the trade goods that made Bronze Age life comfortable. The merchants got the infrastructure of ports and roads and administrative systems that made long-distance trade possible. But the system also created tensions. The people at the bottom, who were receiving the least of the system's benefits and bearing the most of its burdens, were always potential sources of social disruption. And when the system began to fail, when the grain ran short and the trade goods stopped arriving, and the palace could no longer provide the benefits that justified its demands, those tensions could erupt. There is some evidence in the archaeological record for this kind of internal social disruption in the period before and during the collapse. The Linear B tablets from several Mycenaean sites in the generation before the destructions record what appear to be emergency measures, the deployment of military forces to guard against threats that may have been internal as much as external. There are references to what scholars interpret as groups described as watchmen or border guards, positioned not only on the coasts, but also on internal routes, which would make more sense as protection against internal trouble than against external invasion. The Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, in addition to describing the battles against the Sea Peoples, also record significant internal unrest. There was a strike by tomb workers at Deir el-Medina, an event remarkable enough in ancient history that it is often cited as one of the earliest recorded labor strikes, in which the workers who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings refused to work because their grain rations had not been delivered. The strike was eventually resolved, but the fact that it happened tells us something about the strains the Egyptian state was under, even as it was fighting off the Sea Peoples. A third internal contradiction was what we might call the problem of complexity itself. The palace societies of the Bronze Age had achieved a degree of complexity that required constant maintenance. The administrative systems, the long-distance trade networks, the specialized craft production, the military establishments, all of these required continuous investment of resources and labor to keep functioning. And as they grew more complex, they also grew more fragile, because each additional layer of complexity added additional potential points of failure. The political scientist Joseph Tainter, in his influential 1988 book on the collapse of complex societies, argued that there is a general pattern in which complex societies invest increasing resources in maintaining their complexity, with diminishing returns, until eventually the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the benefits it provides, at which point collapse becomes not just possible but almost inevitable. The Bronze Age palaces, with their enormous administrative bureaucracies and their expensive military establishments and their complex trade networks, may have been approaching this threshold by 1200 BCE, even before the external shocks arrived. This is speculative, as much of what we are discussing necessarily is, but it is informed speculation, grounded in the actual evidence of the archaeological record, and it points toward an important truth about the Bronze Age collapse. It was not purely a disaster from outside, it was also, in some part, a failure from within. And now let us talk about what happened after, about the Dark Age, about the 4 centuries that separated the Bronze Age world from the Greece of Homer and the Phoenicia of the seafaring merchants and the Israel of the kings. Because the Dark Age is itself a remarkable thing, and understanding it helps us understand the collapse that preceded it. The term Dark Age is, in some ways, misleading. It implies a period of total barbarism, of savagery and ignorance, a complete absence of the things that make civilization recognizable. And that is not quite right. Life went on. People continued to farm and to raise children and to bury their dead and to worship their gods. Some trade continued at a much smaller scale. Some craft production continued in simpler forms. Some oral tradition preserved the memory of the great age that had passed, preserved it in the kinds of stories that would eventually find their way into Homer's epics. But it was unmistakably darker than what had come before. The populations of the affected regions declined significantly. Some estimates suggest by as much as 50 to 75% in the worst affected areas over the course of the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. Long-distance trade effectively ceased. The sophisticated writing systems of the Bronze Age were forgotten. The large towns and palace centers were abandoned. People retreated to smaller, more scattered, more self-sufficient communities. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for the severity of the Dark Age comes from the metallurgical record. Bronze, as we have noted, required both copper and tin in particular had to come from distant sources. During the Bronze Age, the long-distance trade networks that brought tin from wherever it came from were robust enough to supply the bronze smiths of the Aegean and the Levant and Anatolia with what they needed. During the Dark Age, those networks were gone, and the evidence suggests that bronze production declined sharply. People made do with what they had. They recycled old bronze. When even that was not enough, they used iron. This is actually one of the reasons that the period following the Bronze Age is called the Iron Age rather than the Bronze Age. Iron was available locally in many places where tin was not. Iron ore could be smelted using charcoal and bellows in relatively small local operations without the complex international trade networks that bronze required. Our iron tools and weapons were not initially better than bronze ones. Early iron was often inferior in quality, but iron was available. It could be produced locally. It did not require the long-distance trade that had ceased to function. The transition to iron production is, in this reading, not primarily a technological triumph, but a response to scarcity. People did not abandon bronze for iron because iron was better. They turned to iron because bronze was becoming unavailable, and in the process, they developed the techniques to work iron effectively, and eventually those techniques did produce better iron, and the Iron Age became a genuine technological improvement over what had come before, but it started as an adaptation to loss. This is a pattern that appears again and again in the archaeology of the Dark Age. Adaptations to scarcity, simplifications driven by necessity, the abandonment of complex systems that could no longer be maintained, replaced by simpler systems that required less input and less coordination. Smaller pottery with simpler decoration, smaller buildings using simpler construction techniques, smaller communities, more self-sufficient, less dependent on trade. It is, in the context of the collapse, a kind of survival response. The complexity that characterized the Bronze Age palace world had become unsustainable, and the Dark Age was, in part, the process by which human communities found a sustainable level of complexity again. A painful process, a costly process, but ultimately, it seems, a necessary one. And at the end of it, something remarkable happened. The communities that had survived the Dark Age began to reconnect. Trade began to pick up again. New writing systems were developed, and one of them, the Phoenician alphabet, which the Greeks borrowed and adapted, and which eventually became the Greek alphabet that became the Latin alphabet, that became the alphabet you are now hearing, was far simpler and more flexible than the syllabic writing systems of the Bronze Age. Any literate person could learn to read and write in the new alphabetic systems, not just palace scribes trained over years in complex sign lists. Ideas could spread more easily. Knowledge could be preserved and shared more widely. The Greek city-states that emerged from the Dark Age were genuinely new things, different in fundamental ways from the palace kingdoms that had preceded them. The polis, with its citizen body and its more open political culture and its agora, its public space for assembly and commerce and debate, was not a continuation of the Mycenaean world. It was something new, built on different principles, adapted to different circumstances. And those new principles and new circumstances produced, in the centuries that followed, one of the most remarkable cultural flowerings in human history. Philosophy, drama, democracy, history as a discipline, the systematic inquiry into what had actually happened in the past and why, an inquiry whose first great practitioners, Herodotus and Thucydides, were themselves children of the world that the Bronze Age collapse had, in the long run, made possible. Is there a lesson in this? Is there something we can take from the Bronze Age collapse and apply to our own time? That is, perhaps, a question for another night, and for you to think about in the quiet space between now and sleep. For now, let us simply sit with the story. Let us sit with the compelling immensity of it. the way it resists simple explanation, the way it involves climate and culture and economics and politics and human behavior, all tangled together in ways that cannot be fully separated. Let us sit with the humanity of it, with the scribes and the merchants and the palace administrators and the farmers and the refugees and the people who died in the destruction and the people who survived it and rebuilt. Let us sit with the strangeness of the Dark Age, those 4 centuries when the world went quiet, when the knowledge of how to write was lost, when the long-distance trade that had knit the world together fell silent, when the great palace cities were ruins, and the stories of what they had been were preserved only in oral tradition, in the kinds of songs and stories that wandering poets sang in the halls of minor chieftains, until one of those poets, or one who came after, put it all together in the form of 2 enormous epics that are still read today, because that is the other strange thing about the Bronze Age collapse. It did not erase everything. It erased the material world of the Bronze Age almost completely. The palaces burned, the records were lost, the trade ceased, the cities were abandoned, but something survived, not in writing, which was forgotten, but in story, in the oral tradition, in the memory that human beings have always maintained, imperfectly, incompletely, but persistently, of a time that was different and greater, and in some ways more glorious than the present. Homer remembered Mycenae, even though he had never seen it except perhaps as a ruin. He remembered the great fleet that sailed to Troy, the heroes who fought and died there, the gods who intervened in human affairs with careless power. He did not remember it accurately, because no oral tradition can preserve the past accurately over 4 centuries of telling and retelling. What he remembered was a kind of myth of the Bronze Age, a memory of greatness that was also a story about the costs of greatness, about the way that magnificent achievements can be undone, about the relationship between human ambition and human fragility. The Iliad is, among other things, a story about the Bronze Age world, about the kind of world that existed before the collapse, about a war between great powers, fought with bronze weapons, involving the kind of international politics and coalition building and diplomatic maneuvering that the clay tablets of Hattusa and Ugarit have confirmed was real, about the scale of ambition that the Bronze Age made possible, and the scale of destruction that ambition could produce. And the Odyssey is, among other things, a story about what came after, about the difficulty of returning from a world that has ended to a home that has changed, about the long, hard journey back from the heroic world to the ordinary world, about resilience and adaptation, and the kinds of human qualities that allow survival in a world that has been fundamentally changed. Whether Homer knew that his epics contained this kind of symbolic resonance is not something we can know, but the resonance is there, and it has been felt by readers for 2,500 years. Let us now return to some of the more specific details of the collapse, because there are aspects of it we have not yet explored and that deserve attention. We have talked about the big picture, the interconnected civilization, the multiple stresses, the destruction, the Dark Age. Now let us zoom in on some particular stories and particular places that illuminate the larger story in useful ways. Let us go to Cyprus. The island sat at the center of the Eastern Mediterranean and had been, as we noted at the beginning, a major copper producer and a key node in the Bronze Age trade network. The late Bronze Age cities of Cyprus, places like Enkomi and Kishon, and Kalavassos Ios Dimitrios, were wealthy and cosmopolitan, deeply embedded in the international trading system. The evidence from Cyprus around 1200 BCE is particularly interesting because it suggests not a single catastrophic destruction, but a more complex sequence of events spread over several decades. Some Cypriot sites were destroyed and abandoned early in the period. Others survived the initial disruptions and actually seemed to have received refugees and continued to function for some time. And then eventually, they too were abandoned or destroyed. The letters from the king of Alashia, which we quoted earlier, describing attacks by enemy ships, suggest that Cyprus experienced the kind of seaborne raids that were hitting the Levantine coast at the same time. But the Cypriot archaeological record also suggests that some parts of the island may have remained functional for longer than the mainland sites, perhaps serving for a time as a refuge for people displaced from destroyed cities elsewhere. There is interesting evidence that some of the material culture associated with the Sea Peoples, particularly certain types of pottery and certain architectural features, appears on Cyprus before it appears in the Levant. This has led some scholars to suggest that Cyprus may have been a staging point, a place where some of the displaced Aegean populations settled temporarily before moving on to the Levantine coast. If true, this is another piece of the complex mosaic of the collapse, another indication that it was not a simple event, but a long and complicated process involving the movement of multiple groups of people in multiple directions over several decades. What happened to Cyprus in the end? The Bronze Age cities were destroyed or abandoned, but Cyprus was not permanently depopulated. New settlements appeared, with new pottery styles, different from the late Bronze Age Cypriot tradition, but also different from the styles of the Aegean invaders, suggesting a complex mixing of populations. The copper mines continued to be worked, eventually under Phoenician influence, as the Phoenicians of the later period extended their commercial networks to include Cyprus. The island re-emerged from the Dark Age earlier and more smoothly than many parts of the region, perhaps because its copper resources made it worth investing in, regardless of the political disruptions on the mainland. Let us also look more carefully at the Hittite Empire, because its collapse is in some ways the most dramatic of all the Bronze Age disappearances, and because the Hittites have been somewhat in the background of our story so far, which does not reflect their actual importance. The Hittite Empire at its height was one of the great powers of the ancient world, comparable in scale and sophistication to Egypt and Babylon. At various points, it controlled most of Anatolia, parts of Syria, and had influence that extended as far as Mesopotamia. The Hittite kings, called Great Kings, corresponded on equal terms with the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of Babylon and the rulers of Assyria. Their capital at Hattusa was a major city with miles of defensive walls, multiple temples, elaborate state archives, and a court that was as sophisticated in its diplomatic protocols as anything in the contemporary world. The Hittite archive, which contains more than 30,000 clay tablets, is one of the richest sources of information about the late Bronze Age world. It includes diplomatic correspondence, religious texts, legal codes, historical annals, and a remarkable collection of treaties. The Hittites were prolific treaty makers with various peoples and states. The archive has been studied intensively since its discovery in the early 20th century, and it continues to yield new insights as more tablets are translated and analyzed. What does this archive tell us about the final years of the Hittite Empire? It tells us that the last Hittite king, who can be clearly identified in the records, Suppiluliuma II, was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. He was dealing with problems in the west, in Anatolia, where various groups were restless. He was managing the ongoing relationship with Egypt to the south. He was dealing with Assyria to the east, which was growing more aggressive and threatening Hittite client states in northern Syria. And he was fighting some kind of naval battle in the waters off the Anatolian coast against people who came from the island of Cyprus or who were using Cyprus as a base. That last detail is fascinating in the context of what we know about the Sea Peoples. It suggests that the naval threat to the eastern Mediterranean trade networks was already manifesting in the waters around Anatolia before it moved south to strike the Levantine coast. The Hittite king, whatever else was happening, was aware that something was coming from the sea. And then, at some point in the years around 1180 BCE, Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The last tablets in the archive end mid-sentence, mid-administrative process, in the same way that the Pylos tablets end and the Ugarit letters end, with the work of the state simply stopping as though cut off by a blade. What we do not know is who burned Hattusa. There are several possibilities. The people from the western Anatolian coastal regions, peoples the Hittites called by names like Kaska and Arzawa, who had been troublesome on and off throughout Hittite history, and who seem to have grown more aggressive in the final years of the empire. The Sea Peoples themselves, having come north from the Levantine coast or west from Cyprus. Internal rebellion within the empire, or some combination of all of these. The archaeology of Hattusa itself is frustratingly uninformative on this point. The city was burned, and then it was abandoned. No destruction layers clearly linked to a particular attacker. No bodies or weapons left behind in quantities that would indicate a large battle. Just the burned buildings, the abandoned city, and the silence of the ending records. One intriguing possibility that some scholars have raised is that Hattusa was not so much destroyed by invaders as deliberately abandoned by the Hittites themselves. There are some indications in the archaeological record that movable valuables were removed from the city before the fire, which would be more consistent with a planned evacuation than with a sudden attack. If this is true, if the Hittite royal family and court saw the situation as hopeless and chose to abandon their capital and move elsewhere rather than fight to the death, it raises the question of where they went. Some Hittite successor states emerged in southern Anatolia and northern Syria in the subsequent period, using Luwian language and Hittite-style administration, and it is possible that the Hittite royal lineage continued in one or more of these states, though the connection is not proven. The fall of Hattusa is, in the end, one of the great mysteries of the Bronze Age collapse. As mysterious in its way as the destruction of Pompeii is to us, the violent ending of a civilization at the height of its power, leaving behind only ruins and the records that happened to survive the fire. The night is deepening now. The world outside is quiet, and we have been traveling for a long time through this ancient story. Let us rest here for a moment. In the space between the fall of Hattusa and what came after, there is a particular quality to the silence of abandoned places. Anyone who has walked through ruins, through the empty corridors of a palace or a castle, or a house that was once full of life, knows this. The silence is not empty. It is full of something that is almost but not quite the memory of all the sounds that once filled it. The footsteps of the palace scribes, the voices of the merchants arguing prices in the agora, the laughter of children in the residential districts, the hammering of the bronze smiths in their workshops, the chanting of the priests in the temples. The ruins of Hattusa, which you can visit today in the hills of central Turkey near the town of Bogaskale, still carry this quality. The massive stone gates still stand, including the famous King's Gate with its relief of a warrior carved into the jamb, and the Sphinx Gate with its two Sphinx sculptures in Egyptian style, a reminder of the wide cultural connections of the Hittite world. The foundations of the temples and the palace buildings can still be traced across the rocky hillsides. The outlines of the archive rooms, where the 30,000 clay tablets were found, are still visible, but the sound is gone. The voice is gone. The tablets that preserved the voice are now in museums in Ankara and Istanbul and Berlin. Their contents gradually being translated and understood, a project that has been going on for more than a century and is not yet complete. The city itself is dust and stone and silence. The archaeologists who excavated Hattusa found, among other things, large quantities of clay tablets that had been thrown around and scattered, as though in a hurry or in the chaos of destruction. They found the remains of elaborate frescoes on the walls of the palace buildings, frescoes that had depicted the gods and the rituals of the Hittite state. They found the evidence of fire in the destruction layers, and they found, in the storerooms of the palace, the remnants of the incredible administrative apparatus that had run the empire, the sealed jars and the weights and the official seals, all the material infrastructure of a state that had believed itself to be permanent. The Hittites believed in their gods. They believed in the divine protection of their capital. The inscriptions of their kings are full of references to the favor of the storm god Tahuna and the sun goddess of Arina and the other deities of the Hittite pantheon. They built the great temples at Hattusa to house these gods, to perform the elaborate rituals that maintained the gods' favor, to ensure the continued prosperity and power of the empire. And then the gods failed them. Or rather, the complex of forces that we have been discussing overwhelmed. Even the most elaborate religious and political and military systems that the Hittite state could bring to bear. The storm god did not come to the defense of his city. The walls that had been built to last forever lasted for perhaps 3 or 4 centuries and then fell to fire and abandonment. There is something deeply human about this. Every civilization that has ever built something great has also believed that it would last forever. The Romans built the eternal city. The Egyptians built for eternity. The Hittites built their walls to be impregnable. And every civilization has eventually been wrong. The Bronze Age collapse is, among other things, a reminder of this, of the gap between what human beings believe they are building and what they are actually building, of the difference between the permanence we imagine and the impermanence we get, of the way that forces outside anyone's control, climate, drought, social disruption, the cascading consequences of interconnected systems under stress, can bring down in 50 years what it took 500 years to build. Let us, in these late hours of our journey, spend some time with a few of the other peoples and places caught up in the collapse that we have not yet given enough attention. The Assyrians, as we noted earlier, survived the Bronze Age collapse, and indeed came out of it in some ways stronger than they went in. The Middle Assyrian Empire, centered in the Tigris Valley, in what is now northern Iraq, had been a significant power in the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. Its kings trading and fighting with the Hittites and the Egyptians and the Kassites of Babylon and the Mitanni. During the period of the collapse, Assyria experienced its own disruptions, including pressure from Aramean nomads from the Syrian steppe who were moving into the settled areas of Mesopotamia. But Assyria did not collapse. It went through a difficult period, contracted, reorganized, and eventually emerged from it to become, in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the most formidable military power the ancient world had yet seen. The great empire that would eventually conquer and deport the northern tribes of Israel and bring Egypt under its control. The resilience of Assyria, compared to the collapse of the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, is itself an interesting data point. Assyria was also a complex state, also dependent on trade and agriculture, also subject to the same broad climatic and political pressures that affected the rest of the region. Why did it survive when others did not? Partial explanations include geography. The Tigris Valley was less dependent on long-distance maritime trade than the Levantine coast or the Aegean Islands. Irrigation agriculture in Mesopotamia was more reliable than rain-fed agriculture in the areas most affected by the drought. The Assyrian military tradition, which emphasized not just conquest, but the systematic organization of conquered territory and the deportation and resettlement of populations to ensure control, may have given the Assyrian state a kind of resilience under pressure that the more loosely organized palace economies of the Hittites and Mycenaeans lacked. And Babylon survived too, though also diminished. The Kassite dynasty, which had ruled Babylonia for nearly 5 centuries, one of the longest ruling dynasties in ancient history, was overthrown around 1155 BCE. But Babylon itself was not destroyed. New dynasties took over and continued the Babylonian cultural tradition. Cuneiform writing continued to be used. The great religious and literary texts of Mesopotamia continued to be copied and studied. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation epic, the various wisdom texts and hymns and mathematical tables that make up the library of ancient Mesopotamia, these continued to be transmitted through the Dark Age, not because they were isolated from it, but because the scribal tradition of Mesopotamia was embedded in a culture resilient enough to maintain it. The contrast with the Mycenaean world is stark. In Mesopotamia, the scribal tradition was attached to religious institutions, to temples that were more durable than the palace economies of the Aegean. In the Mycenaean world, literacy was a palace function, and when the palaces burned, literacy burned with them. This difference in the organizational basis of knowledge transmission may be one of the reasons that the Mesopotamian Dark Age, such as it was significantly less dark than the Greek one. Mesopotamia experienced disruptions, certainly. Trade declined, political organization fragmented. But the basic cultural continuity was maintained in a way that it was not in the Aegean. The Phoenicians are another remarkable story of the post-collapse world. The great Canaanite city of Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt. But other Canaanite cities further south, Byblos and Sidon, and Tyre in particular, survived the initial disruptions of the collapse, perhaps because they were slightly more peripheral to the trading networks that were most disrupted, perhaps because their geography gave them some protection. or perhaps just by chance. And in the centuries after the collapse, these cities became the core of what we call Phoenician civilization, one of the most commercially active and culturally influential peoples of the ancient world. The Phoenicians were merchants above all else. They rebuilt the trade networks that the collapse had destroyed. They developed new ones. They pushed the boundaries of the known world in pursuit of commercial opportunity. Their ships ranged not only through the eastern Mediterranean, but into the western Mediterranean, and eventually through the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic, reaching the coasts of Spain and possibly Britain and the West African coast. They founded colonies throughout the Mediterranean world, the most famous of which was Carthage on the coast of North Africa, founded in the 9th century BCE and eventually becoming a great power in its own right. The Phoenicians gave the world its alphabet, the system of writing they developed or inherited from earlier Canaanite scribes, a simple set of signs representing consonant sounds that could be learned in a few days, rather than the years required to master the syllabic and logographic systems of the Bronze Age, was one of the most consequential inventions in human history. The Greeks borrowed it, added vowel signs to it, and created the Greek alphabet. From Greek it became Latin. From Latin it became the scripts of all the modern Western languages. The Arabic script and the Hebrew script are also descendants of the Phoenician original. The alphabetic writing system that makes possible the wide literacy of the modern world emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age, developed by the survivors of the catastrophe to meet the needs of a simpler and more commercially driven world. There is something almost beautiful about this. The Bronze Age collapse destroyed, among many other things, the elaborate syllabic writing systems that required years of palace-sponsored education to master. The world that grew up in its place developed something simpler, more democratic, more adaptable. The loss of complexity produced, eventually, a more widely distributed capability. The destruction of the palace economies, which had concentrated literacy in the hands of a small specialist class, led eventually to a world in which literacy was accessible to ordinary merchants and farmers and soldiers, and, eventually, philosophers and poets and historians. It is too neat to say that the Bronze Age collapse was necessary for the achievements of later antiquity. Too many people died. Too much was lost. The suffering was real, and it was vast. But it is worth noting that some of what grew from the ruins of the Bronze Age was, in certain ways, better than what had been destroyed. More flexible, more widely accessible, more capable of the kind of individual creativity that produced philosophy and democracy and tragedy. All things that require a social environment in which individual thought is valued and possible, an environment that the palace economies of the Bronze Age, with their rigid hierarchies and their centralized control of resources and their conception of the individual as a unit in an administrative system, did not naturally produce. And now, as the night grows very deep and the world outside is truly quiet, let us come back to the central question. Why? Why did all of this happen? Why, after centuries of relative stability and prosperity, did the interconnected world of the late Bronze Age simply fall apart? We have been through the theories: climate change and the drought, the sea peoples and the question of who they were and where they came from, earthquakes and their role as amplifiers of existing stress, internal social contradictions in the palace economies, the brittleness of complex, centralized systems. And the answer, insofar as there is one, is all of the above. The Bronze Age collapse was a systemic failure, a cascade in which multiple stresses arrived simultaneously or in rapid succession and overwhelmed a system that had become too complex, too interconnected, and too dependent on continuous, favorable conditions to absorb them. The drought reduced agricultural productivity across the region. Reduced agricultural productivity meant reduced food surplus, and reduced food surplus meant that the palace economies, which depended on surplus to feed their administrative classes and their military establishments and their craft workshops, were under immediate stress. Cities that had been importing grain could no longer import enough of it because the grain-producing regions were themselves producing less. People went hungry. Social tensions that had always existed but had been manageable in conditions of general prosperity became acute. At the same time, or perhaps slightly before, groups of people in the Aegean world, themselves displaced by the disruption of the agricultural and trade systems that had sustained them, began moving eastward and southward. They moved not as an organized army with a single command structure, but as multiple groups with different compositions and different motivations, some raiding, some seeking to trade, some looking for places to settle. They appeared off the coasts of Anatolia and the Levant and Cyprus, where they were seen as threats, and in some cases were threats, because hungry and desperate people are dangerous. The seaborne raids disrupted the coastal trade that the palace economies depended on. Merchant ships that had been crossing the Mediterranean became dangerous or impossible. The reduction of maritime trade reduced the flow of copper and tin and grain and the other commodities that kept the palace systems functioning. The palace systems, already under stress from drought and internal tensions, found themselves additionally strained by the disruption of trade. And then there were earthquakes and perhaps other environmental disruptions, adding physical destruction to economic and social stress. Each of these stresses, taken alone, might have been manageable. The Bronze Age world had survived droughts before, and trade disruptions before, and earthquakes before, but all of them together, arriving in the same generation, or even the same few decades, was too much. The system, which had been designed and optimized for conditions of relative stability and continuous inputs of the commodities it needed, could not adapt quickly enough to the combined shock. When the palace centers began to fail, the collapse cascaded. The administrative systems that maintained the long-distance trade networks required the palaces to function. Without the palaces, the trade networks collapsed. Without the trade networks, the communities that depended on them for grain and tin and copper were unable to sustain themselves. The people who could leave did so, some joining the waves of displaced humanity that were moving across the region. The people who could not leave either died or survived in diminished circumstances, forming the smaller, simpler, more self-sufficient communities of the Dark Age. It was not an instantaneous collapse. It took decades. Some places fell early, some survived longer. There were probably communities that tried to maintain something of the old ways, even as the system around them was falling apart. Palace administrators going through the motions of record-keeping in cities that were shrinking around them. Merchants trying to maintain trade routes that were becoming more dangerous and less profitable with each passing year. Kings writing letters to foreign rulers who might not even be alive anymore. But eventually, the system reached a point of no return. The administrative systems were too disrupted to rebuild. The trade networks were too broken to restart. The populations were too reduced and scattered to provide the labor force that the palace economies required. The knowledge of how to run the system, which was concentrated in a small class of palace specialists, was dying off without being passed on to successors. The world of the Bronze Age was over. What replaced it was not nothing. What replaced it was, eventually, something new. And that new world, smaller and simpler at first, harder and more precarious, eventually grew into things the Bronze Age could not have produced. Democracy, the alphabet widely taught, philosophy, the beginnings of science, drama, history, individual human thought expressed in writing. Not just palace administration. The world we live in today is, in a very real sense, the child of the Bronze Age collapse, as much as it is the child of the Bronze Age itself. The collapse was not only destruction, it was also, in the long run, a clearing, a making of space for something new. But we should not romanticize that. We should not make the mistake of thinking that the people who lived through the Bronze Age collapse were fortunate to experience the end of their world because something better was coming. They did not know something better was coming. They did not know anything was coming at all, except disaster. The woman in her house in Ashkelon, whose skeleton archaeologists found in the ruins, did not know that the Phoenicians would one day develop an alphabet. The scribe in Ugarit, who sealed his letter and placed it in the kiln, did not know that 3,200 years later, scholars with computers and international conferences would be able to read his words. The palace administrator at Pylos, who was trying to organize rowers and gather bronze for weapons, did not know that the fire was coming that night, or that his baked clay tablets would survive the fire to become, millennia later, one of the primary sources of knowledge about the world he was trying to save. They were just people, doing what people do, trying to manage the crises of their day with the tools they had available, loving their families, doing their work, hoping things would get better, and in the end being overwhelmed by forces larger than any individual, larger than any palace, larger than any empire. That is the deepest truth of the Bronze Age collapse. It is not a story about inevitable progress, or about the triumph of simpler peoples over more complex ones, or about the judgment of history on civilizations that had become too proud or too corrupt. It is a story about the fragility of the complex systems that human beings build, about the way that multiple stresses, arriving together, can overwhelm even the most sophisticated adaptive systems, about the gap between the permanence we imagine and the impermanence we inhabit. And it is a story about resilience, too, about the fact that even after one of the most devastating collapses in human history, life went on, not the same life. Not for a long time the good life, the prosperous and connected and culturally rich life of the Bronze Age at its height. But life continued. Stories were told, children were born, farmers planted grain in the ruins of palaces, and eventually, slowly, people built again. In the year 750 BCE, roughly 450 years after the destruction of Ugarit and the burning of Pylos and the abandonment of Hattusa, a poet, or a collection of poets, composing under the name of Homer, gathered the threads of the oral tradition that had preserved the memory of the Bronze Age and wove them into the Iliad and the Odyssey. The poems they produced are among the most influential works of literature in human history. They have been read and studied and translated and retranslated for 2,500 years. They gave Western literature some of its most enduring images and characters and stories. They shaped the way that ancient Greeks and Romans thought about heroism and war and fate and the gods and the relationship between human beings and the cosmos. And at their heart, beneath all the particular stories about Achilles and Odysseus and Helen and Hector and the gods who meddle in human affairs, there is a memory of a world that was greater than the present, a world of kings who commanded vast fleets and fought in wars of extraordinary scale, a world of bronze weapons and palace walls and gods who walked among men, a world that was lost, that ended in fire and wandering and the long silence of the Dark Age. Homer did not understand the Bronze Age collapse as a historical event. He could not have. The records that would allow a historical understanding of it, the clay tablets of Pylos and Hattusa and Ugarit, the Egyptian inscriptions of Medinet Habu, the letters of the kings, had been buried or forgotten for centuries. What Homer had was the folk memory of the event, distorted and mythologized by 4 centuries of retelling, transformed from history into myth, from complex social and environmental catastrophe into stories of divine will and human heroism. But even in that mythologized form, something of the truth remained. The sense of a world that had been magnificent and had been lost. The sense that greatness is fragile, that the gods do not guarantee the survival of their favorites, that the greatest heroes die and the greatest cities fall and the greatest empires end. The sense that the appropriate response to this is not despair but continued effort. The stubborn, resourceful, human insistence on going on finding the way home, even when the way is long and the obstacles are overwhelming. That is the spirit of Odysseus, who survives the fall of Troy and the anger of Poseidon and 10 years of wandering because he refuses to stop trying to get home. And it is, in some sense, the spirit of the Bronze Age survivors who rebuilt their lives in the ruins of their world, who found new ways to write and new ways to trade and new ways to organize their communities, who kept the stories alive in song and story until someone could write them down again. The Bronze Age collapse is, in the end, a story about us, about human civilization and its characteristic combination of extraordinary achievement and extraordinary fragility, about the complex systems we build that allow us to feed millions of people and build things of great beauty and conduct trade across thousands of miles and develop writing systems and legal codes and diplomatic protocols, and about how those same systems, when they fail, can fail catastrophically, with devastating consequences for the people who depend on them. We live in our own complex, interconnected, sophisticated civilization. We have our own supply chains that stretch across the world, our own systems that require continuous inputs of energy and materials and expertise to function, our own populations that have grown beyond what local resources alone could sustain. We have our own climate pressures, different in their specific character from the drought of 1200 BCE, but similar in their potential to disrupt the agricultural and economic systems on which we depend. The Bronze Age collapse does not tell us that our civilization will collapse. Civilizations are not all alike, and the tools for managing complexity and disruption have grown enormously since the Bronze Age. We have things the Bronze Age world did not have: scientific understanding of climate and weather and disease, the ability to communicate at the speed of light, the accumulated knowledge of thousands of years of human experience with both catastrophe and recovery. But the Bronze Age collapse does remind us that complexity is fragile, that interconnectedness is both a strength and a vulnerability, that the same webs of trade and communication that allow extraordinary prosperity can also transmit disruption with extraordinary speed, that the administrative systems and supply chains and cultural institutions on which civilization depends require continuous maintenance and attention, that the margin between prosperity and catastrophe is not always as wide as we tend to assume. These are not cheerful thoughts for a night's meditation, but they are true thoughts. And the Bronze Age collapse is, if nothing else, a very honest story. It does not promise that things will be all right. It does not offer easy lessons or simple takeaways. It says only that great things can be lost, and that when they are lost, it takes a very long time and a great deal of suffering before something new is built in their place, and that the new thing is never quite what was lost, but can sometimes, in some ways, be better. The light is very low now. The night is at its deepest, that quiet time between midnight and dawn when the world seems to hold its breath. We have been a long time in the ancient world, walking through the palaces and the harbour towns and the archive rooms and the battlefields of a civilization that ended 3,000 years ago. Let us take one more long look before we go. Imagine standing on a hilltop somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean in the year 1150 BCE, 50 years after the destruction of Ugarit, perhaps 30 years after the abandonment of Hattusa, perhaps the same year that the last fire was set at whatever Mycenaean site was the last to fall. The sea is still there, the wine-dark sea, the same one that Homer would describe centuries later, the same one that the merchants and the warriors and the refugees of the Bronze Age had crossed. It glitters in the sunlight or in the moonlight, exactly as it always has, indifferent to the human drama that has played out on its shores. The mountains are still there, the mountains of Lebanon with their cedars, though perhaps fewer than there were a generation ago, since the palace economies that had organized the timber trade are gone. The hills of Attica and the Peloponnese and the mountains of Anatolia, still there, still the same shapes that the Bronze Age people had lived among and navigated by. The land is still there. The fertile coastal plains, the river valleys, the terraced hillsides where vines and olive trees once grew in managed rows. Some of the vines may still be there, gone wild without the labor that maintained them, growing unchecked up the terraces that are beginning to crumble without upkeep. The olive trees are certainly still there, slow-growing and very long-lived. Some of them perhaps the actual trees that the palace administrators of Pylos or Ugarit once recorded in their inventories. But the palaces are ruined. The walls still stand in places, too massive to be easily dismantled. The great cyclopean masonry of Mycenaean Tyrans, already beginning to look ancient, even though it is only a few decades destroyed. But inside the walls, there is ruin, fallen columns, collapsed roofs. The storerooms that once held hundreds of large pottery jars now open to the sky, the jars smashed, their contents long since spilled or consumed or carried away. The archive rooms where the scribes once worked, now just ash and clay fragments, the tablets scattered. The harbours are quiet, here and there a small boat, a fishing boat perhaps, working the coastal waters. But the great merchant ships that once crowded these harbours, loading and unloading their cargoes of copper and tin and grain and wine and oil and timber and textiles, and ivory and gold, those ships are gone. Where they went is not entirely clear. Some of them were probably burned in the raids. Some of their crews probably joined the waves of displaced people moving across the region. Some of them perhaps found their way to quieter waters and continued a diminished trade. But the scale of the maritime commerce that had knit the Bronze Age world together is simply gone. The cities are empty, or nearly empty. Here and there, in the ruins of the great Bronze Age centers, small groups of people may be living in the upper stories of half-collapsed buildings, as we know they did at some sites, scratching out a subsistence existence on the edges of the world that had been. But the cities, as centers of administration and commerce and culture, as places where thousands of people lived and worked and argued and celebrated and built things that would last, those cities are gone, and the writing is gone. The Linear B tablets, the cuneiform correspondence, the hieroglyphic records, the Ugaritic alphabetic documents, all gone or inaccessible. The people who knew how to read and write those systems are dead or scattered. The knowledge is no longer being transmitted. The records that preserved the names and the deeds and the business transactions and the religious rituals of the Bronze Age world are silent. For the 400 years of the Dark Age, the Eastern Mediterranean world will be essentially unlettered. History will not be recorded. It will be remembered imperfectly in song and story. This is the world after the Bronze Age collapse, and it is, when you sit with it long enough, one of the most haunting images in all of human history. A world made empty, a civilization rendered mute. The great achievement of the late Bronze Age, that interconnected, sophisticated, literate, diplomatically active international system, reduced to silence and ruin by forces that no one entirely understood and no one could entirely control. And yet, standing on that imaginary hilltop in 1150 BCE, if you look carefully, you can see the seeds of what will come. The farmers have not gone, not all of them. The ones who survived are there, tending their fields as farmers have always tended their fields, through war and famine and the rise and fall of empires, because the fields have to be tended, and the grain has to be grown, and the animals have to be fed, whatever else is happening in the world. The farmers are the continuity. They were there before the Bronze Age. They were there during it. They are there after it. And the children are there. The children who were born in the ruins, who will grow up knowing nothing of the palace world except perhaps some story their grandparents told them, some garbled memory of a time when there were great kings and great ships and great buildings. The children who will have to figure out how to live in the world as it is, not as it was. The children who will develop new ways of doing things, simpler ways, more local ways, but ways that will in some cases be more resilient than what came before. The alphabet is being worked out somewhere, in the scribal traditions of the surviving Phoenician cities. The ironworking techniques are being refined somewhere, as craftsmen experiment with the more readily available metal that is replacing the inaccessible bronze. The oral traditions are being maintained somewhere, in the evening gatherings of communities that have no other way to record and transmit what they know. And 400 years from now, give or take, a poet will sit down with all of that and create the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the world will begin to write again, and the story of the Bronze Age will be remembered, even if it is remembered wrong. Remembered as myth rather than as history. Remembered as a time of heroes and gods rather than as a time of complex trade networks and palace economies and catastrophic systemic failure. Perhaps that is not entirely wrong. Perhaps the heroes were real, in their way. The people who maintained the oral traditions through the Dark Age. The craftsmen who developed ironworking. The Phoenician merchants who rebuilt the trade networks. The farmers who kept planting even when the world around them was in chaos. These were their own kind of heroes, ordinary and undramatic, doing the hard, unglamorous work of survival and recovery, building the foundations on which the next great age of human civilization would stand. The Bronze Age collapse is 3,000 years ago. The ruins of Pylos and Hattusa and Ugarit are tourist sites now, or archaeological parks, or excavated fields in the middle of agricultural land, depending on where you go. The clay tablets that preserve the records of those civilizations are in museums, carefully curated and partially translated, still yielding new information as scholars continue to work on them. The sea is still there, the mountains are still there, the land is still there, and we are still here, the descendants of the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse, the inheritors of the world that grew from its ruins, living in our own complex and interconnected civilization, with our own vulnerabilities and our own potential stresses, with our own dependence on systems of trade and communication and energy that require continuous maintenance to keep functioning. We carry the Bronze Age within us, though we do not know it. The alphabet we use to read and write was shaped by the descendants of the Ugaritic scribes. The geometry we learned in school was developed by descendants of the Mesopotamian mathematicians whose texts survived the collapse. The wine we drink and the olive oil we cook with are products of cultivated varieties of vines and trees that were first systematically cultivated in the Bronze Age Mediterranean. The epics we still read, the ones we still make films and television shows about, Achilles and Odysseus and the Trojan War, preserve the memory of the Bronze Age world, however mythologized and transformed. And the lesson, if there is a lesson, is simply this: that human civilization is both extraordinarily resilient and extraordinarily fragile, that it can be built to remarkable heights by the accumulated effort of many generations, that it can be maintained for centuries through the combination of social organization and technical knowledge and cultural transmission, and that it can be undone, not by any single catastrophe, but by the coincidence of multiple stresses arriving at the same time, overwhelming a system that has become too complex and too interconnected and too dependent on continuous favorable conditions to adapt in time. The Bronze Age world was not destroyed by stupidity or wickedness or weakness. It was destroyed by a combination of circumstances that its people, who were by any measure sophisticated and capable and organized, could not manage. And in that lies the deepest lesson. Not that we should build simpler civilizations, because simpler civilizations are not necessarily better, not necessarily more just or more creative, or more capable of the things that make life rich and meaningful, but that we should maintain, in the midst of our complexity, an awareness of our fragility, a humility in the face of the forces that lie beyond our control, a readiness to adapt, to change, to find new ways when the old ways become impossible. The people who survived the Bronze Age collapse and built the world that came after did not survive by clinging to the old ways. They survived by letting go of what could no longer be maintained and finding something new. The new things they found were smaller at first and simpler and in many ways harder, but they were also, in some ways, better, more widely shared, more resilient, more capable of growing into something that the rigid hierarchies of the palace world could not have produced. Perhaps that is enough lesson for one night. Perhaps it is more than enough. The hour is very late. The world outside is very quiet. The Bronze Age has receded back into the comfortable distance of history, 3,000 years away, safely ancient and safely concluded. Its ruins visited by tourists, and its tablets studied by scholars, and its memory preserved in the epics that have become part of our cultural inheritance. But it was not always past. It was once present. It was once the entire world, vivid and loud and full of people going about their lives. And then it was not. And that is a thing worth knowing, worth sitting with, worth carrying gently into sleep and into the morning. Thank you for spending this night with this ancient story. Thank you for listening to the silence between the ruins. The sea is still there. The mountains are still there, and somewhere in the stones of the Peloponnese, and the hills of Anatolia, and the coast of Lebanon, the memory of the Bronze Age world sleeps in the earth, waiting patiently, as it has waited for 3,000 years, to be found and known and understood and remembered. Sleep well. The night is deep, and the world is very old, and somewhere under the stars, the ruins are quiet, and the story continues. History at night. Because some stories are best told in the dark. But let us not stop here quite yet, because there is more to tell, and the night is long, and the story of the Bronze Age has depths we have not yet plumbed. There are individual lives we can follow into the collapse. There are specific objects recovered from the ruins and from the sea itself that carry within them extraordinary stories. There are questions we have raised, but not fully answered, and some of them are worth returning to with fresh eyes. Let us start with an object, or rather, a collection of objects. The cargo of a ship that sank in approximately 1300 BCE off the coast of what is now southern Turkey, near a place called Uluburun. It was found in 1982 by a sponge diver named Mehmed Shakir, who noticed strange lumps on the seabed at a depth of about 44 meters and reported them to archaeologists. What followed was one of the most extraordinary underwater archaeological excavations in history, a decade-long project that recovered more than 17,000 individual objects from the wreck. The Uluburun shipwreck is not technically from the period of the collapse. It predates it by about a century, but it is perhaps the single most vivid illustration of what the Bronze Age trade world actually looked like in practice. And it is impossible to understand what was lost in the collapse without first understanding what it looks like when such a world is functioning normally. The ship itself was about 15 meters long, a merchant vessel of moderate size by the standards of the late Bronze Age. It was probably carrying a mixed cargo collected from multiple ports of call around the eastern Mediterranean, as was typical for the merchant ships of the period. When it sank, it carried to the bottom, with it a cargo so varied and so exotic that it reads like an inventory of the entire Bronze Age world. There were 10 tons of copper ingots, cast in the distinctive oxhide shape that was the standard form for bulk copper transport in the late Bronze Age. 10 tons. That is enough copper to outfit several palaces with bronze fittings, or to equip a substantial army with bronze weapons and armor. There were also 1 ton of tin ingots, the other ingredient of bronze, confirming that these metals were being transported together as the raw materials for bronze production. There were glass ingots, in the deep cobalt blue and turquoise colors that the Bronze Age world prized for decorative work. There were ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa. There were ivory tusks, both elephant and hippopotamus. There were ostrich eggshells. There were nearly 200 copper and tin, and glass, and ebony and ivory objects, representing goods from Cyprus and Canaan, and Egypt and Nubia, and quite possibly from as far away as the Baltic coast. Among the personal possessions of the crew and passengers were gold jewelry, including a gold scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, the famous queen of Akhenaten. There were Canaanite jewelry pieces. There were Mycenaean swords and arrows. There was a wooden writing board, hinged like a modern book, that would have been coated with wax for writing and then scraped clean and reused, the Bronze Age equivalent of a tablet computer. There were merchants' weights in bronze and stone, standardized to the different measurement systems used by different trading partners. There were fishing equipment and oil lamps and personal tools, the ordinary paraphernalia of life aboard a merchant vessel. The Uluburun ship was, in other words, a floating microcosm of the late Bronze Age world. Its cargo came from every corner of the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Its crew and passengers appear to have represented multiple different cultural backgrounds, based on the personal objects found with them. It was crossing the sea on a commercial mission that connected the palace economies of the mainland with the copper sources of Cyprus and the various luxury goods that circulated through the Bronze Age trading system. When such a ship went down, it was a commercial catastrophe. The merchants who had assembled that cargo and were counting on its safe delivery had lost everything. The palace, or palaces, that were expecting the copper and tin and ivory and ebony would have to wait for the next ship or find alternative sources. Individual families might be ruined by the loss. Now multiply that by 100, by 1,000. Imagine the systematic disruption of the maritime trade routes that carried cargoes like the one on the Uluburun ship throughout the Bronze Age world. Imagine the copper not arriving in the Aegean because the trading networks have broken down. Imagine the tin not reaching the bronze smiths because the routes by which it traveled from its distant sources have been disrupted. Imagine the grain ships from Egypt not coming because Egypt is itself under attack, or because the merchants who normally organize such shipments have been displaced or killed. That is the collapse of the Bronze Age trade system. Not abstract, not theoretical, but the failure of ships to arrive, the failure of cargoes to be assembled and transported. The failure of the complex multi-party commercial networks that had taken centuries to build and that kept the palace economies supplied with the materials they needed to function. The Uluburun ship tells us what was lost. The letters from Ugarit tell us how quickly it was lost. And the silence that follows, the silence of the Dark Age, in which no more such ships are documented, in which the harbour towns of the Aegean and the Levant have no more merchant ships to record, tells us what the world looked like after the loss. Let us talk about the people who were actually doing the trading. Because the Bronze Age trade world did not operate through impersonal market mechanisms. It operated through networks of personal relationships, families and business partners who trusted each other across the distances of the Mediterranean, who sent goods to each other on consignment and kept track of debts and credits across years and sometimes decades. The archives of Ugarit give us a remarkable window into this world. Among the thousands of tablets found there are the records of a family of merchants named the Rapsayu family, who were active in the final century of Ugarit's existence. Their archive shows us the actual texture of Bronze Age commercial life in extraordinary detail. The Rapsayu family were wealthy and well-connected. They had business relationships with merchants in Egypt, in Cyprus, in Canaan, in Anatolia. They traded in metals and textiles and grain, and it seems, wine. They extended credit and called in debts. They had their disputes recorded in legal tablets that show them arguing with business partners over contracts that had not been fulfilled or payments that had not been made. They had their triumphs, recorded in inventories of goods that show the accumulation of wealth over years of successful commerce. And they had their anxieties. In the final years of Ugarit's existence, the tablets of the Rapsayu family begin to show evidence of stress. Commercial arrangements that had worked for decades are falling apart. Partners in other cities are not paying their debts. Shipments that were expected have not arrived. The normal commercial rhythms of the Bronze Age world are being disrupted. We do not know what happened to the Rapsayu family when Ugarit burned. We do not know if they escaped, or if they were killed in the destruction, or if they fled and rebuilt their lives somewhere else. Their archive simply stops in the middle of an ordinary commercial dispute, at some point in the final months or years before the city was destroyed. But they were real people. They had names. They had business partners and family members and favorite clients and trusted agents who sailed their goods across the sea. They had worries and ambitions and the kind of professional pride that comes from doing difficult work well over a long career. They were caught up in something that no individual could have predicted or controlled, the collapse of the entire system within which their lives had been organized. There is a particular sadness in reading their tablets, in following the traces of their commercial activities through the records, in seeing the moment when the records simply stop. They did not know the records were stopping forever. They were just doing their work, managing their accounts, dealing with their problems, and then the fire came and it was over. We should also spend some time with the religious dimension of the Bronze Age world and its collapse, because religion was not separate from the rest of Bronze Age life in the way that we might be tempted to imagine. It was woven into everything, into the commercial and political and social life of these civilizations, in ways that make it impossible to understand the collapse without at least touching on what the gods meant to the people who believed in them. The Hittites, as we noted, believed themselves to be under the protection of their gods, and their religious obligations were taken with the utmost seriousness by the state. The king himself was the chief priest, responsible for performing or organizing the performance of a vast cycle of religious rituals throughout the year, rituals that maintained the proper relationship between the human and divine worlds, and thus ensured the continued favor of the gods. If a ritual was performed incorrectly, or if it was omitted, the consequences might be divine punishment in the form of drought or disease or military defeat. The Hittite archives include detailed instructions for religious festivals and rituals, careful prescriptions for exactly how things were to be done, what offerings were to be made at what times, in what quantities, what words were to be spoken, what movements were to be performed. The care and detail of these instructions suggests people who genuinely feared the consequences of getting it wrong. And in the final years of the Hittite Empire, there is evidence in the texts of anxiety about whether the proper rituals are being maintained, of efforts to identify what might have gone wrong, to explain the misfortunes that were befalling the empire, of consultations with oracles, to determine what the gods required. This is deeply human. When things go wrong, people look for explanations. When the old explanations fail, they look harder. When the droughts come, and the armies fail, and the trade breaks down, and the cities are threatened, the people who believe in divine protection inevitably ask what they have done to displease the gods. What ritual has been omitted or performed incorrectly? What transgression has brought this punishment upon them? The Hittite texts show this process in agonizing detail. Plagues that struck the Hittite lands in the mid-13th century BCE, probably infectious diseases, spread along the very trade routes that made the Hittite world so prosperous, led the king Mursili II to compose what scholars call the Plague Prayers, a series of magnificent texts in which the king addresses his gods directly, confessing the sins of his father and asking for forgiveness and an end to the suffering. The prayers are moving documents, full of a desperate sincerity that needs no translator to communicate. This man is genuinely frightened. He genuinely believes that he and his people are being punished for something they have done or failed to do, and he is desperately trying to find the right formula, the right confession, the right offering, to make things right. The plagues did eventually end, or at least diminished enough that the Hittite Empire recovered and survived for another century. But the experience of the plague and the theological wrestling it provoked shows us the kind of intellectual and spiritual life that characterized the late Bronze Age world. These were not simple people with crude superstitions. They were people trying to make sense of a world that regularly surprised and overwhelmed them, using the conceptual tools available to them, which were religious rather than scientific, but which were not therefore simple or unthinking. And when the collapse came, the final one, the one from which the empire did not recover, we can only imagine what the final religious responses were, what prayers were said, what oracles were consulted, what explanations were offered for why the gods had finally failed to protect the people who had served them so faithfully and for so long. We do not have those documents, because the final collapse was too sudden and too complete. The tablets that might have recorded the theological response to the collapse were destroyed in the same fires that destroyed everything else. But we can imagine, because the religious response to catastrophe has not changed that much over the millennia. People pray, people search for explanations, people wonder what they did wrong, people cling to whatever hope the sacred texts and the priestly tradition can offer. And some people, in the midst of the catastrophe, find that the sacred texts and the priestly tradition are not enough, that the world has changed in ways that the old religious frameworks cannot accommodate, that new ways of thinking, new relationships with the divine or the sacred, are needed for the new world that is emerging from the ruins. Perhaps this is part of what explains the religious flowering of the centuries immediately after the Bronze Age collapse. The period between roughly 900 and 600 BCE saw an extraordinary burst of religious innovation across the surviving cultures of the ancient world. The Israelites, emerging from the disruptions of the collapse period, developed their distinctive monotheism, the idea of a single God who demanded exclusive loyalty, an idea so radical in the polytheistic world of the ancient Near East that it eventually produced two of the world's major religions. The Greeks developed their distinctive relationship with their gods, a relationship that is oddly non-servile, oddly argumentative, oddly philosophical, very different from the more deferential religious posture of the Bronze Age. The Zoroastrian religion emerged in the Iranian world, with its radical dualism between good and evil, its ethical rather than ritual conception of divine favor. The Vedic traditions of India were being composed and organized. It is too much to claim that the Bronze Age collapse directly caused this religious innovation. The connections are not that simple or that direct, but there is something to the idea that the collapse, by destroying the old world and its old certainties, created a space in which new ways of thinking about the divine were possible. When the old gods had failed to protect the great palace civilizations, when the rituals and the temples and the royal priesthoods had proven insufficient to prevent catastrophe, perhaps there was room for asking new questions about what the divine actually was and what it actually required. The Israelites deserve more time than we have given them, because their story is uniquely intertwined with the Bronze Age collapse in ways that matter enormously for the subsequent history of the world. The emergence of the Israelites as a distinct cultural and religious entity is one of the most debated questions in ancient history and biblical archaeology. The biblical narrative places the Exodus from Egypt at a particular historical moment and the conquest of Canaan in the period that follows. The historical reality of these events and their relationship to the archaeological record has been argued about for more than a century, and the arguments are not resolved. What we can say, with some confidence, is this. The period of the Bronze Age collapse, roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, saw major disruptions in the population distribution of the Levant. The great Canaanite city-states, which had for centuries organized the settled population of the region under Egyptian nominal suzerainty, were destroyed or severely weakened. Egyptian power in the Levant, which had been real if not always directly exercised, retracted. The population density in the lowland city areas declined dramatically. At the same time, the archaeological record shows a significant increase in small villages in the highland areas of Canaan, particularly in the central hill country. These villages are small, often without defensive walls, and they are organized very differently from the Canaanite city-states of the Bronze Age. They are subsistence farming communities, more egalitarian in their social organization, without the palace centers and the administrative hierarchies of the Bronze Age city system. These highland villages are, in the prevailing scholarly interpretation, the earliest Israelite settlements, not a people who marched in from the desert and conquered the Promised Land in a series of dramatic military victories, as the biblical narrative would have it, but a people who emerged in the highland areas of Canaan precisely because those areas were relatively unaffected by the destruction of the lowland city-states. A people who were, in part, former residents of those city-states, people who had fled the disruption of the coastal and valley cities, in part, perhaps, pastoralists who had previously ranged through the region with their flocks, in part, possibly some group who had spent time in Egypt and returned with a distinctive religious identity centered on the worship of a god called Yahweh. The amalgamation of these different groups into a coherent, cultural, and eventually political entity was a process that took centuries, and the Bible, which represents this process in a more dramatic and unified way than the archaeology fully supports, is nonetheless a genuine memory of it, however transformed by centuries of retelling and theological interpretation. What matters for our story is that the Israelites were, in a very real sense, children of the Bronze Age collapse. They emerged from its ruins. The space in which they developed was created by the destruction of the Canaanite city-states that the collapse had brought down. The religious innovations that would eventually produce Judaism, and through it Christianity and Islam, were worked out in the centuries immediately following the collapse, by a people who were grappling with the theological implications of the catastrophe they had witnessed and in some cases survived. The God of Israel, as the tradition eventually developed, was very different from the gods of the Bronze Age palace world, where the Bronze Age gods were many, and their favor was obtained through elaborate ritual and expensive sacrifice in state temples run by professional priests. The God of Israel was one. His favor obtained through ethical behavior and personal loyalty rather than ritual. His relationship with his people conceived in terms of covenant rather than service. This is a dramatically different religious conception, and it grew, at least in part, from the failure of the Bronze Age religious world, from the experience of watching the great palace temples burn and the great state priesthoods fall silent, and the divine protection of the old gods prove inadequate. Whether or not that interpretation is correct in its particulars, it points to something important, that the Bronze Age collapse was not only a material catastrophe, but also an intellectual and spiritual crisis, one that forced the peoples who survived it to find new ways of understanding their place in the cosmos, new frameworks for making sense of why things happened the way they did, new conceptions of what the divine was and what it asked of human beings. Let us think for a moment about memory, about how civilizations remember the catastrophes that befall them, about what gets preserved and what gets lost, and how the shape of what is remembered affects the way future generations understand their inheritance. The Bronze Age collapse was, in the direct sense, largely forgotten. The palace civilizations that were destroyed were so thoroughly destroyed that their physical remains were buried under centuries of later occupation or simply abandoned to the elements. Their writing systems were forgotten. Their administrative records were buried under ash. Their royal dynasties were remembered, if at all, only in the most garbled and distorted forms in the oral traditions that survived. When the Greeks of the classical period thought about the Bronze Age, they thought about it almost entirely in terms of myth. The Age of Heroes, the Trojan War, the labors of Heracles, the voyage of the Argonauts. They had no idea that the ruins of the great walls at Mycenae and Tiryns had been built by human beings not so different from themselves, using techniques that were demanding but not supernatural. They attributed those walls to giants, to cyclopes, to beings of superhuman power, because they could not imagine how mere human beings had moved such stones. The reality, which is that the palace economies of the Bronze Age could organize and motivate the labor of thousands of workers over decades to accomplish exactly such feats of construction, was entirely beyond their ability to reconstruct. The Romans had an even more distant relationship to the Bronze Age. The Mycenaeans and Hittites and Canaanites of the late Bronze Age were as remote from the Romans as the Romans themselves are from us. They were mythological figures, the stuff of epic poetry and religious tradition, not historical actors who could be studied and understood. It was only with the development of scientific archaeology in the 19th century, and particularly with the astonishing discoveries of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that the Bronze Age world began to be recovered. Schliemann's excavations at Troy and Mycenae in the 1870s and 1880s, however flawed in their methods and interpretation, were genuine revelations. The discovery of Minoan civilization at Knossos by Arthur Evans in the early 20th century opened another window into the pre-collapse world. The discovery of Ugarit in 1929 and the subsequent excavation of its archives. The decipherment of Linear B in 1952 by Michael Ventris. The discovery and analysis of the Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found in Egypt in 1887 that gave an almost cinematic view of the diplomatic world of the 14th century BCE. Each of these discoveries added something to our understanding of the world that was lost. Together, they have allowed us to build the picture of the Bronze Age world that we have been walking through tonight. A picture still incomplete, still contested in many of its particulars, but recognizable as the picture of a real civilization, not a myth. And with that recognition came something else. The recognition that the Bronze Age collapse was not a myth either, that it was a real event, a real catastrophe, something that actually happened to real people in real places. And with that recognition comes the kind of humility that genuine historical understanding sometimes produces. The recognition that great things can be lost, that sophistication and prosperity and cultural achievement do not guarantee survival, that the forces that ended the Bronze Age were not exceptional, were not the product of some unique combination of wickedness or weakness, but were the kinds of forces, climate, disease, population, movement, systemic stress, that can strike any civilization at any time. There is one more thing we should talk about before the night is entirely over. One more angle on the Bronze Age collapse that we have touched on but not fully explored, and that is the question of what, if anything, was saved. We have talked about what was lost: the palaces, the writing systems, the trade networks, the administrative sophistication, the scale of cultural achievement that the palace economies made possible. These losses were real and they were enormous. But some things were saved, and tracing what was saved, and how it was saved, and why certain things survived when so much else was lost, is one of the most interesting questions we can ask about the aftermath of the collapse. The most important thing that was saved was human knowledge and skill, even when it was simplified and stripped of its most elaborate forms. The bronze smiths who survived the collapse knew how to work metal. They applied that knowledge to iron instead of bronze when bronze became unavailable, and in doing so, they developed the iron working techniques that defined the next stage of human civilization. The potters who survived made simpler pottery, with less sophisticated decoration, using simpler kiln techniques, but they kept the basic knowledge alive, and it served as the foundation for the later development of more sophisticated ceramic production. The farmers who survived kept the knowledge of how to cultivate the particular crops and trees that had been domesticated and improved over centuries of Bronze Age agriculture. The specific varieties of wheat and barley and grape and olive that would continue to sustain Mediterranean civilization for millennia, and some traditions of literacy survived, even if not in the palace-centered forms they had taken in the Bronze Age. In Mesopotamia, as we noted, the scribal tradition attached to religious institutions was maintained through the Dark Age. The cuneiform script continued to be used. The great works of Mesopotamian literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish and the Atrahasis flood story, continued to be copied and transmitted. When the Dark Age ended and the Iron Age civilizations of the Near East began to flourish, they had access to a continuous tradition of Mesopotamian intellectual culture that had never been completely broken. In the Levant, the Phoenician scribal tradition maintained the alphabetic writing system that the Ugaritic scribes had pioneered. The Phoenician alphabet, as we have noted, would eventually give rise to all the alphabetic writing systems in the world. Its survival through the Dark Age, in the scribal traditions of the cities that the collapse did not entirely destroy, was one of the most consequential survivals in human history. And the oral traditions, the songs and stories and genealogies, and religious texts that people maintained without writing, carried within them more than we might expect. They carried the outlines of the historical past, even if the details were distorted. They carried religious and ethical frameworks for understanding the world. They carried the names of the heroes and the kings, even if those names were attached to stories that bore little relationship to the historical reality. And when writing returned, all of this material was available to be set down and preserved in more permanent form. Homer's epics are the most famous example, but they are not the only one. The early books of the Hebrew Bible contain material that, in various ways, reflects the conditions of the Bronze Age and the transition period after the collapse. The religious and historical traditions of the peoples of the ancient Near East carried within them memories, transformed and mythologized, but not entirely erased, of the great age that had preceded them. And when those traditions were eventually written down, they became part of the permanent record of human civilization. So we should not think of the Dark Age as purely a period of loss. It was also a period of transformation, of adaptation, of the slow and painful process by which the shock of the collapse was absorbed and something new began to take shape. The things that survived were not always the things we would have chosen to save. Much of the most sophisticated Bronze Age culture was simply lost because the systems that maintained it were gone and could not be rebuilt in the short term. But the essentials, the agricultural knowledge, the metalworking skills, the basic social organization, the oral traditions that preserved the memory of what had been, these survived. And from them, eventually, a new world grew. We have been on a long journey tonight. We have walked through the palace corridors of Mycenae and Hattusa and Ugarit. We have stood in the harbours of Cyprus, watching the merchant ships load their cargoes. We have read the letters of the last king of Ugarit, describing the approaching danger, the first sight of enemy ships on the horizon, the frantic efforts to warn neighbours who could not be reached in time. We have followed the trail of destruction, from the Aegean to the Levant, from the Greek mainland to the coast of Anatolia, from the Levantine coast to the borders of Egypt. We have sat with the Hittite king as he wrote his plague prayers. We have watched the darkness fall over the Mediterranean world, and we have watched the slow, tentative return of light. The Phoenicians rebuilding their trade networks, the Greeks developing the polis and the alphabet, the Israelites working out their distinctive theology in the highland villages of Canaan, the ironworkers developing their craft in the ruins of the Bronze Age, the oral poets weaving the memories of the Great Age into the stories that Homer would eventually write down. We have asked the question that haunts the Bronze Age collapse: why? And we have found that the answer is complicated, that it requires climate and trade and social organization and individual choices and collective failures and pure bad luck, all working together in ways that overwhelmed a civilization that was genuinely sophisticated and genuinely capable, but that was also genuinely fragile. We have sat with the sadness of it, with the woman in Ashkelon and the scribe in Ugarit and the palace administrator in Pylos and the Hittite king in his burning capital, with all the people whose names we do not know and whose faces we cannot see, but whose lives were changed or ended by something they could not fully understand. And we have sat with the strange hope of it, with the knowledge that life continued, that from the ruins something grew, that the descendants of the Bronze Age survivors built things that the Bronze Age itself could not have built, things that have lasted in different ways, in writing and in thought and in the shape of civilization, much longer than the palace walls that are now just rubble and stone. The Bronze Age collapse is, in the end, a story about the human condition, about the way we build and the way we lose, about the forces that are larger than any individual or any civilization, about the stubborn persistence of life even in the aftermath of catastrophe, about the way that from ruins, given enough time and enough human effort, something new always seems to grow. That is not a comfortable story. It is not a story that promises safety or permanence or the guarantee that the things we have built will last, but it is an honest story. And in its honesty, in its refusal to offer easy consolation, there is a kind of deep respect for the people who lived it, who did not have the comfort of knowing how the story would turn out, who faced their catastrophe with the only tools they had, their intelligence and their courage and their willingness to keep going, even when keeping going seemed impossible. Tonight, in the quiet hours of this night, we have sat with those people for a while. We have let their world become a little more real to us. We have let the 3,000 years between us thin a little, become a little more permeable. We have heard, or tried to hear, something of the sound of that lost world, the merchants arguing in the Ugaritic harbour, the scribes working in the archive rooms, the bronze smiths hammering in their workshops, the palace administrators recording every jar of olive oil, the ships crossing the wine-dark sea, and then the silence, the long silence. And then, eventually, the first stirrings of something new. Before we finally let the night take over, let us do one more thing. Let us trace the journey of one more object, or rather, of one category of object, from the Bronze Age world into the world that followed. Because sometimes the best way to understand historical continuity across catastrophe is to follow something concrete, something physical, something that can bridge the gap between the lost world and the surviving one. The jar, the ceramic storage jar, the amphora, the pithos, the large pottery vessel in which the Bronze Age world stored and transported its most essential commodities. Wine, olive oil, grain, fish sauce, perfume. The Mycenaean palace storerooms were full of them. The ships that crossed the Bronze Age Mediterranean were loaded with them. The Ugaritic merchants used them to store and transport their trade goods. The Egyptian records are full of references to their contents and their quantities. During the Dark Age, the large-scale production of storage jars declined significantly because the palace economies that had produced and managed them in vast quantities were gone. Pottery continued to be made, but it was simpler, less standardized, produced on a smaller scale for local use rather than in the standardized forms required for long-distance trade. But the tradition did not die. The knowledge of how to make pottery, how to build the kilns, how to work the clay, how to shape the forms that best served the purposes of storage and transport, this knowledge was maintained through the Dark Age in smaller, more local workshops. And when trade began to revive in the Iron Age, the amphorae came back, different in their precise shapes, adapted to new needs and new technologies, but recognizably the same basic form. Storage jars for wine and olive oil and grain, crossing the Mediterranean in merchant ships, keeping the populations of the ancient world supplied with the commodities they needed. The Greek amphora of the classical period, which you can see in any museum of classical antiquities, is directly descended from the Bronze Age storage jar, not through an unbroken chain of identical production, but through the persistent human need for a practical solution to the problem of storing and transporting liquid goods, maintained through the Dark Age by people who never entirely stopped making pottery, even when the great palace workshops were gone. The form survived because the need survived. The need for food and wine and oil is more fundamental than any particular civilization. It endures through the rise and fall of empires, through the burning of palaces and the forgetting of writing systems and the silence of abandoned cities. The need for a container to hold the things you must have to live, that need is permanently human. And in that small, practical, utterly ordinary object, the storage jar, the amphora, the pithos, there is something that the most elaborate theories about the Bronze Age collapse cannot fully capture. There is the simple persistence of human life. the insistence on continuing to eat and to drink and to store supplies for the winter, the making of something to hold the things you need, even when the world around you has been reduced to ruin. The Bronze Age fell, the palaces burned, the writing was forgotten, the trade networks collapsed, and somewhere in the hills of the Peloponnese, or the coast of Lebanon, or the islands of the Aegean, someone was making a pot. Not a palace pot, not a pot for the royal storerooms, not a pot that any administrator would have recorded in his inventory, just a pot, a simple, functional, handmade pot for storing oil or wine or grain. Just enough to get through the winter, just enough to keep going. That is the human story. Not the grand narrative of civilizations rising and falling, not the political and economic analysis of what caused the Bronze Age collapse, not the archaeological debates about which specific group burned, which specific city. The human story is the pot on the hearth and the fire under it, and the person who made them both, and the family who needed what they held, and the morning that came after the night, always, the morning that came after the night. Sleep well, now. The pot is on the hearth, and the fire is warm, and the night is deep, and the world, for all its troubles, is still here. 3,000 years after the greatest catastrophe of the ancient world, the world is still here. That is, perhaps, the most comforting thought we can carry with us into sleep. The Bronze Age fell, the Dark Age came. And then, slowly, in the small villages, and the surviving cities, and the wandering families of merchants, and the highland farms, life continued. Not the same life. Not the life that had been, but life. And from that life, eventually everything else. Good night, sleep deeply. Dream of nothing more troubling than the sound of the sea. History at night. There is a particular kind of peace that comes at the very end of the night, when the darkness has reached its fullest depth and the world is entirely still. A peace that is not the absence of thought, but the arrival of a different kind of thought, slower and gentler and less insistent. The kind of thought that settles like dust settling after a long day, finding its level, coming to rest. We have been in the ancient world for a long time tonight. We have walked through civilizations that are 3,000 years gone. We have held, as gently as we could, the weight of what was lost, and we have traced, as carefully as we could, the slow, stubborn return of what survived. We have asked difficult questions, and we have received, as the honest record of the past always gives us, incomplete and complicated answers. We have been reminded that great things are fragile, and that human beings are persistent, and that the world has a way of continuing, even when it seems impossible that it should. These are the thoughts to carry into sleep, not as anxieties, not as heavy things to be worried about in the dark, but as companions, as reminders that we are part of a very long story, longer than any of us can fully comprehend, a story in which catastrophes have come before, and things have continued, and new worlds have grown from old ruins, and the morning has always, in the end, come. The night is your time, the quiet is yours, the rest that comes now is yours, and somewhere, in the deep past, the ruins of Hattusa are cool and dark under the stars of central Turkey, and the ruins of Ugarit are silent under the soil of the Syrian coast, and the ruins of Pylos are quiet in the soft air of the Greek peninsula, and in all of them, in the hardened clay of their archives, the voices of the people who lived there are still speaking, slowly and patiently, waiting for someone to listen. We listened tonight, we held the story, we let it be real, and now we let it go, gently, the way you let go of the day when sleep comes for you, the way the world releases itself into the dark each night and trusts that the morning will come. It will come, it always does. Sleep well. History at night, where the past meets the quiet. There is one more thing I want to share with you before the night is entirely done. One more thread worth pulling, and it concerns something that has been present throughout our journey tonight, without being fully named, which is the question of what it feels like to lose a world. Not to lose things within a world, the ordinary losses of individual lives, the deaths of people we love, the passing of particular places and particular moments, but to lose the world itself, to live through the transition from one kind of world to a fundamentally different one, to be part of a generation that experienced the end of everything familiar. The people of the late Bronze Age, the Mycenaean scribes, and the Hittite officials, and the Ugaritic merchants, and the Egyptian temple priests did not think of themselves as people living in a world that was about to end. Of course they did not. No one thinks of themselves that way. We are always in the middle of our story, not at the end of it. We assume that the systems that sustain us will continue because they always have before. We assume that the world we grew up in is the world that will continue because it has always continued. The Bronze Age people had good reason to believe this. Their world had been continuous for centuries. The palace at Mycenae had been there for 200 years. The Hittite Empire had been there for 4 centuries. The Egyptian tradition that undergirded the New Kingdom stretched back not centuries but 2 millennia. These were not fragile, recently established systems. They were old and solid and enduring. They had survived wars and famines and earthquakes and internal political crises. They had every reason to expect to survive whatever came next, and then they did not. The person who experienced the end of the Bronze Age world, if we can imagine them, might have spent years in denial. Surely this crisis would pass, as all previous crises had passed. Surely the trade would resume, the grain would arrive, the palace would recover, the familiar world would reassert itself. People have a remarkable capacity to believe in the continuity of things they have always known, to find reasons to hope that the world they understand will come back. And then, at some point, the realization, not for everyone at once, not dramatically, not in a single moment of clarity, but slowly, reluctantly, in the accumulation of evidence that the old world was not coming back, the ships that did not arrive, the grain that was not coming, the neighbors who had left and not returned, the palace administrators who were no longer being paid, the priests of the great temples performing their rituals in spaces that were becoming increasingly hard to maintain, and finally, the fires, and the abandonment, and the silence. What does a person do when they realize that the world they have always known is genuinely ending, that the systems they depended on, the systems that gave their work meaning and their life structure, are not coming back? This is not a hypothetical question. It is a question that people have faced in various ways throughout human history, and it is a question that some people face in our own time, when the communities or industries or ways of life in which they grew up are no longer sustainable. The honest answer is that there is no single response. Some people fight to maintain the old ways as long as possible, going through the motions of a system that is no longer functioning, because the motions are familiar, and because giving them up means admitting that everything has changed. Some people leave, seeking somewhere that still functions, becoming the refugees and migrants whose movement across the collapsing Bronze Age world we have traced tonight. Some people find ways to adapt, carrying what they can of the old knowledge and the old skills into new contexts, becoming the bridge between the world that was and the world that will be. It is the adapters who matter most, in the end, for the survival of civilization, not the ones who fought hardest to maintain the old ways, and not the ones who fled most effectively, but the ones who took what was salvageable from the old world and found ways to use it in the new one. The potters who kept making pots, simpler pots, but pots. The metal workers who turned to iron when bronze became unavailable. The scribes who maintained their knowledge in reduced and simplified form. The farmers who kept tending their fields through the chaos. The storytellers who kept the memory of the Great Age alive in song, so that Homer could eventually write it down. These people are not famous. They have no names in the historical record. They are the anonymous majority whose quiet persistence made recovery possible, whose refusal to entirely give up on the accumulation of human knowledge and skill kept that accumulation alive through the Dark Age and allowed it to form the seed of the next flowering. We owe them something, I think. Not in any practical sense, since they are long dead and beyond any reach of gratitude, but in the sense of recognition, of acknowledgement, of not letting their persistence be lost in the grand narrative of collapse and recovery. They were there, they kept going, and because they did, we are here. That is the thought to carry into sleep, that the thread of human persistence runs through even the darkest periods, even the most complete seeming collapses. That there have always been people who kept going, who maintained what they could, who passed on what they knew, who refused to let the flame go out entirely, and that the world we have inherited, with all its complexity and all its problems is in part their gift to us. The accumulated legacy of every person who kept going when keeping going seemed impossible. Sleep gently now. The night is very deep. The Bronze Age is 3,000 years away, and we are still here. And the morning will come, and the story will continue. Good night. History at night. One last thought, and then truly the night can have you. There is a quality to ancient places that I have been thinking about all through our journey together tonight. A quality that is hard to name precisely, but that anyone who has stood in the ruins of a very old place will recognize. It is not sadness exactly, although there is sadness in it. It is not awe exactly, although there is awe in it. It is more like the sensation of the present moment becoming temporarily thin, almost transparent, so that for just a second, you can almost see through it to what was. Standing in the ruins of Hattusa, which I described to you earlier, the massive stone gates and the scattered foundations and the long views over the central Anatolian plateau, there are moments, usually in the early morning or the evening, when the light falls in a certain way and the wind moves through the grass on the ancient walls and the birds call from somewhere unseen, and for just a moment, it is possible to almost feel what it was like to be there when it was alive, not to see it, not to hear the voices or the footsteps, not to smell the smoke of the cooking fires, but to feel, in some way that is more visceral than intellectual, that people were here, that this was a place, that lives were lived within these walls, with the full intensity that all lives are lived. That feeling is what draws people to ancient places, what draws archaeologists to spend their careers carefully brushing dirt from the remnants of past worlds, what draws historians to spend their years learning the languages of vanished civilizations so they can read the letters and the administrative records and the religious texts that those civilizations left behind. What draws you, perhaps, to spend your nights listening to stories about the ancient world as you drift towards sleep? It is the feeling of connection, of belonging, however briefly and however imperfectly, to the long human story, of recognizing in the people of the Bronze Age, with all their strangeness and their distance, something that is also familiar, the need to eat and to drink and to shelter their families, and to trade and to build and to understand their world and to communicate with each other and to find meaning in the face of forces beyond their control. They were us. Not exactly, not in the details of their lives or their beliefs or their social structures, but in the fundamentals, in the need to make sense of the world, in the desire to build something that will last, in the capacity for extraordinary achievement and extraordinary failure, in the way that catastrophe, when it comes, finds people doing ordinary things in ordinary ways and overwhelms them before they fully understand what is happening. They were us. And they are gone. And we are here. And someday we will be gone too, and someone else will be here. Perhaps asking questions about us the way we ask questions about the Bronze Age, perhaps marveling at what we built and wondering why it ended the way it did. That thought, which could be terrifying, can also be oddly comforting. We are part of the long story. Our chapter is not the last chapter. The world that outlasted the Bronze Age will outlast us too, and go on, and the people who come after will find in our ruins, as we have found in the ruins of the Bronze Age, traces of real lives, lived with real intensity, full of real hope and real loss, and the stubborn human insistence on continuing anyway. Good night. Thank you for listening. Sleep well, wherever you are, whatever time it is there, in your part of this ancient world. The story is long, and you are in it, and the morning will come. History at night. And if you find yourself returning to this story on another night, that is perfectly fine. Some stories deserve more than one sitting. The Bronze Age collapse is one of them. There is always more to find in the ruins, more to read in the tablets, more to understand in the silence of the ancient places. The archaeologists are still digging. The translators are still working. New discoveries are still being made, even now, after a century of intensive excavation. The story of the Bronze Age is not finished being told. It is only resting, like everything else at this hour, resting and waiting for morning and for the next set of hands, willing to do the careful, patient work of recovery. That is enough for tonight. Rest now. The ancient world has been here for 3,000 years. It will be here tomorrow. History at night. Every night. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And thank you, across the distance of 3,000 years, to everyone who kept going. We are here because of you.